I'm sure I would have seen Nicholas Gruen's tweets pixelated across my screen prior to this, but when I was first given an introduction to this economist worldview, it was in fact in the middle of a previous interview. I was seated across from a man wearing 3 vapes from 3 lanyards. We were outdoors in a parking lot in a sunny rural London cafe, and it turns out Rory Sutherland had been singing Gruen's praise for years. But in one of the many twists of his erudite thinking, he suggested out of nowhere, "You have to speak to Nicholas Gruen. He's wonderful on this." I shared as much with the man seated across from me today, and thankfully he was generous enough with his time and space to allow me to follow up on Rory's demand. As soon as I started looking into Mr. Gruen's Substack and work, it became abundantly clear why he's top of Rory's mind, and heaping praise from the likes of Martin Wolf, calling him the most brilliant economist you've never heard of. Well, not anymore, dear listener. It seems there is no topic or niche value of interest that escapes Gruen's worldview. When we first got on the phone to discuss the podcast technicalities, 2 hours later we finally got around to them, solving the problem of faith in the meantime. Nicholas Gruen is the CEO of Lateral Economics, a visiting professor at King's College London's Policy Institute, former chair of the Australian Centre for Social Innovation, constructor of the HALE Index of Wellbeing, loads more as well, but someone I'm extremely lucky to have gotten to have spoken with today. We discussed the HALE Index, the McDonaldization of politics, a bit of the cancerous nature of pokies, your core idea, which maybe you want to just say what it is.
Well, I'd say my core idea is that there are 2 ways to represent the people in a political system. One is by being represented by people we elect, and the other is what we do in juries, and that is to be represented by people like us, people sampled from the community, drawn by lottery. And secondly, that we need a political system that does across the board what has already been done by Magna Carta in the judicial branch of government, and that is to have a jury entangled with the pyramid of power and patronage, for each of those things to be checks and balances on the other in running our political system.
Which we definitely go top to bottom on. I would call it a new interesting idea. Nicholas corrected me and said it's in fact very, very old.
It's an old, interesting idea.
But it will sound at least radical and fresh, and hopefully you'll end up agreeing with it as well. Anything else you want to add?
No.
It is now my pleasure and good fortune to play the podcast we just recorded. What is the HALE Index, and what does it reveal about Australia's progress?
Okay, so the HALE Index is a nice name that I gave an index that Ross Gittins, the chief economics correspondent of the Sydney Morning Herald, asked me to build, and that is an index. Lots of people will have heard of this. The rhetoric is, in fact, the rhetoric comes direct. Bobby Kennedy is the most eloquent person to put that rhetoric in 1968, and he says, our GDP tells us, it measures all the dollars that pass through our economy, but every time someone adds a lock to their door or buys a gun or shoots someone and then they go to hospital, all of those things get measured by GDP, and they all drive GDP up. And then he says, in short, it doesn't measure the content of our character, the quality of our schools, the quality of our families, and so on. And then he says GDP, in other words, measures everything except what is most important to us. Now, that's a nice sentiment, and it surfaces regularly, about every 15 years, when people get a bit embarrassed about how well they're doing. They say we should have a measure like GDP that tells us more than just how many dollars are circulating in the economy. And this is responsible for endless false starts. And if you want to see one, you can read a paper that the Centre for Policy Development put out just last month about how to rejig government policy in pursuit of well-being. And I'm a critic of that, but I'm not a critic. If you want to build an index of well-being, you need to understand that what you're trying to measure is not very measurable. So you know that you are going to be, it'll be crude, but
maybe directionally right, but not exactly right.
And so it's absolutely the case that we make decisions constantly. Should we invest more in this number of hospital beds or in school places or in cops on the beat and so on. And, well, to take a simple example, when people are working on a health question, they've invented this thing called QALYs, which is quality adjusted life years. If you can give someone another 9 months, but they're in an iron lung, maybe it's not worth doing. If you can intervene in such a way that you spend $100,000, but you cure, say, an autoimmune disease for a young kid of 4, then you give them a whole life.
The quality's more than the person with the iron lung at the end of their life.
Lots more. Now, there's something that our common sense and our moral sense rebels against that. They say, because you say you can't measure these things in dollars and cents. But the point is you're interacting with a system that has to make choices. And so do you want to help them make that choice? And the answer is yes. But if you want to build an index that helps us say, has our well-being grown, rather than many of the things that lots of people have done, we can talk about that if you like. What I did was I said, let's start with GDP. Let's start with the economic measure. Let's come up with some quick and dirty things we can do to correct things that are obviously wrong and wrong in a big way. And so that's essentially how the HALE Index works. It does things like says, if we have a windfall, we might end up talking about resource rent in Australia. If we have a windfall, we can do 2 things. We can all go on a holiday, and when we come back, it'll be paid for, and that's fine. Or we can invest it in our children's education. And we want a measure of economic well-being that tells us that second course is going to generate more economic well-being than a holiday.
Right.
So that's what I built. And there are lots of people with faux indexes, with pretend indexes. Let me give you an example. Well, I'll give you an example. The OECD, that's a pretty august body, isn't it?
Okay.
So what do the OECD do? They say, well, well-being, how are we going to define well-being? Well, well-being is, your housing's important, your health's important, your social conditions are important, your politics is important. These are all, so we'll have these as dimensions to our well-being index. And then you go and get some numbers on these things, and of course they're all pretty incommensurate with each other. And then you say, how should I measure? So what weighting should I give income? What weighting should I give housing? What weighting should I give
life expectancy?
Health? What weighting should I give life expectancy? And basically you've got no idea. And then there's another...
Because the problem is how you measure it?
Well, yes,
or just
you've made Herculean assumptions about measuring it, but if you're going to, another one of these metrics is self-reported well-being.
Right.
To get self-reported well-being, you ask someone between 0 and 10, how would you rate your self-reported well-being?
Could be anything more subjective than that.
Well, 1, it's subjective, but 2, you can't get above 10, can you?
Right.
Now, if you map this against GDP, whatever GDP is this year, it can be higher or lower next year. So if you say that over 35 years, GDP's increased, but self-reported well-being has not increased, well, there will be a time when it can't increase. If we get it to 10, which we never will, it can't increase. So none of this makes any sense. It's completely incoherent. And then there's another issue, which is that housing and income are heavily correlated. Most of these things correlate with each other. So this index is a big flashing sign saying, don't go this way. Go back to the start and see if you can do a better job. Well, who does that in politics and bureaucracy? They just keep going through the motions. So I tried to build this thing, and one of the things that turned up, the big things that were driving it, is that some of the things that we added was obesity is a thing which is it's a widespread issue, and there's good evidence that it lowers well-being. Mental health, anxiety and depression, likewise. And education is something which we spend a vast amount of money on education, of our resource on education. Human beings are the the being that we educate our young, and that's now gone that's now spun out to 18 years or something like that. So what people are interested in is, what does GDP tell us and what does this other measure tell us? And what it showed is that during the Gillard years, Gillard-Rudd years, this index that we built, the HALE Index, outperformed GDP because we were building a lot more human capital, because we were moving university attendance up and so on. But the long run, there was also a long run drag on well-being because of obesity and mental health and so on. So it brought out some of these very general things, but again, it doesn't give you any great insights into how to address those things, which is another interesting thing which we could talk about, but anyway.
Just quickly on the mental health and anxiety, do you suspect that mental health and depression is more prevalent now than it maybe has been in the past, or we just have more ways to identify it and therefore it shows in the system?
That's super hard to answer, but what you can say is that you're in a kind of hermetic... If you go out and ask people subjective questions like that, you're in a kind of a hermetically sealed area. You're in a hermetically sealed universe, so that if you go and ask questions like that of people in a Spartan culture, they'll tell you they're fine, even when they're going through hell. That's it would be shameful to do anything other than that. They're all thinking there, but for the grace of God go I. Who am I to complain? I'm doing fine.
The social stigma of being weak if you do complain about it.
Just the internal stigma too. Just the internal stigma.
Right.
Like my father had a grandmother who was engulfed in the Holocaust, and he's not going to be sitting around telling me about multi-generational trauma. He's going to be getting on with a life. And I can't give you an answer to that question, but it's certainly... You wouldn't do the work responsibly if it didn't sort of just hang over, if it wasn't present to you from time to time. And unfortunately, it's not very present to us.
So the HALE Index, you looked at health outcomes, education levels, inequality, environmental degradation, depletion of natural resources, mental health and life satisfaction, job satisfaction. And it's improving much more slowly than GDP growth has been. Like you said, maybe in the Rudd-Gillard years, it ticked up.
Yeah, it ticked up and then it's...
But it's fallen off.
That's right.
So broadly, what's your explanation for that?
My explanation for that is that the long-run weight on it from obesity and anxiety, those are long-run public health challenges. There's also a little bit there from inequality. Those things continue to run and continue to get slowly worse. And the kick we got from more tertiary education started flatlining and possibly even declining somewhat, I'm not sure. So that's basically the story. I mean, it's quite interesting to talk about a couple of those things. One is natural, one is inequality, and the other is natural resources. So with inequality, it's not me turning up saying, hey, inequality is a bad thing, wag of finger. It is an attempt, again, it's somewhat hubristic, it's somewhat grandiose, but it's an attempt to actually go back to an idea that the early 20th century economists had. And so very famous economist Alfred Marshall said that $1 in the hands of a working man was worth more utility than another $1 in the hands of a rich man. He said man. We were not supposed to say that anymore. People, obviously. Arnold Schwarzenegger said the same thing. A few dollars to me doesn't mean much. To some people who really need it, it really does mean something. So there are various ways that you can...
So like how do you measure that distribution?
How do you measure that? And so there are ways, and they're not great, but there are ways in which you can, either by way of experiments or questionnaires and getting people to reflect, you can say to someone, how many dollars would I have to give you if you say you're 7, or let's say you rate yourself a 7 out of 10 in terms of subjective well-being, how much would I have to give you to make you 7.5, to get you to 7.5? And it turns out that our best evidence about that is that it's a share of the income you have now, which means exactly what the commonsensical thing told you, which is that money to poorer people is worth more to them than money to richer people.
Yeah,
again,
which is quite
it's a basic axiom of
self-intuitive.
economics. Yeah, exactly. And it's in fact one of the sort of central to my method, which is in economics, don't ever go very far from common sense because you just don't have it's not physics, you know?
Right. Yeah. They're just recommendations. They're not laws of the universe.
Yeah, exactly.
What metric, if any, do you think the Aboriginals would want to add to the HALE Index or might be most important to them?
Well, I think it's a very strange thing that's a very classic story, which is we turn up and we say, we'll give you your choice of metric.
Right, yeah.
I mean, it's just a totally different language. It's ridiculous. I'm not a big fan of metrics. I think they're necessary. They're very crude. We need them for these big, crude decisions that we make.
In fact, it's such a good example of how just measuring the increase in GDP over time for one specific part of the Aboriginal community is totally missing the point of their well-being.
We turn up and we say, we're going to close the gap. Is that something that has come out of deep engagement with Indigenous people, particularly Indigenous communities, not their spokespeople? Absolutely no way. There are kind of profound contradictions in the whole story, and we just sail by them. So, for instance, we say that we want to close the gap in a material sense, and we also say that we want them to have self-determination. Yeah. Well, it stands to reason that there is some tension between those two things. And can you tell me a leader in Australia who's tried to focus on that tension and said we should try and sort ourselves out on that question? No. We all pretend that it's all nice and we just keep going. We just keep going through the motions. We don't like the big flashing sign. I mean, if you have those two objectives, it's a big flashing sign saying they're not the same. They're in a substantial tension with each other. What do we do when we have to make choices? Because we make choices, and the question is, do we make them by design or by default? And we make them by default because because our whole culture revolves around getting powerful people saying things that minimise offence and minimise difficulty, minimise discomfort. And these are very difficult subjects. So this problem goes back to the First Fleet. The first, Australians can be, let me ask you, what country was the first country in the world to abolish slavery?
I don't know.
Australia. So the Western, the European nation of Australia, well, it wasn't a nation, it was a colony, it was called New South Wales. So when Governor Phillip was given the commission to be the governor of the First Fleet, he's an Enlightenment guy, and they say, we want you to do this. And he says, not if there's slavery, not having slavery. So they go, okay. That's well before Wilberforce. Wilberforce is in short pants, or maybe not even with us at that point. 1787, I suppose. So that's something we can be incredibly proud of. And then he gets here, and then he puts up this sign, and the sign has intended for Indigenous consumption, and the sign has an Indigenous person stealing something or killing someone, and then they get strung up or beaten or something. And then they have an Indigenous, they're trying to say, if you do these things, we will punish you, and we will do the same for white people. And they have another picture there. They also get the locals, the Indigenous folks, and they say, come round and watch us flog one of our people for stealing from you. Well, nobody has got the slightest idea what's going on. They're going, this is gross. This is just, why did you invite us to this hideous event? So right from the start, there were good intentions which went nowhere. And
because
here we are.
Culture superseded the actual law.
No, because to engage, these are two civilizations from different planets, and that's hard. A different language, but even if you have, you might get on top of some of the language points. They just, everything about them is different.
The foundational story is completely...
And so we turn up, we're the powerful ones, and we say, look, we're just pretty great, we're pretty terrific.
We just got off a ship.
Yeah, look, you're going to love it here. And there's a few of them who take an interest in the language and stuff, but even so, it's freighted with, the noble savage and all this. There's no real engagement, and here we are, and we're in roughly the same situation.
But to return to the original question, is there one unit of measurement, that's the wrong way to phrase the question, but rather one index on the HALE Index that you think would be most relevant to the Aboriginals?
Well, I think if I was trying to have an index, the sort of thing that the sort of metric that I go for is what I call a metric of kind of soft subversion. And what I mean by that is a metric that's going to tell you when you're having a lend of yourself. So I guess I would be interested in a metric. I'd be interested in a metric that you could get from younger Indigenous people, but Indigenous people generally, asking them, are they feeling optimistic? Are they feeling like the world is giving them agency, that there's stuff that they can do in their lives that they're going to be proud of? Those kinds of things. I also kind of believe in those sorts of metrics inside corporations and things.
Right,
You're sort of getting the voice from below, because the voice from below...
Feeling you're a part of it, not just a cog.
Well, yeah, but just the voice from below is always suppressed either brutally, which is the old way, or with great subtlety.
Yes, exactly.
Through elaborate HR systems. And you know, Utopia, the comedy, covers a lot of those things. They have these HR people coming in.
You recommended it. I haven't seen it yet.
Well, you know, HR just make nonsense of everything. And it's all a kind of a therapy to get the raw material into a nice form.
Right, yeah.
So on.
If tomorrow we replaced GDP
Mm.
with the HALE Index, what do you suspect would be the first one or two big errors that we would make?
Errors?
For instance, now we're making all these assumptions based off the HALE Index. Where are we going to go wrong, do you suspect?
Yeah. Well, there's a thing sometimes known in economics as Goodhart's law, which is when you when you take the transition from identifying something as a measure of, you know, as a thing that you watch to measure something to turn it into a target, then it loses all value.
Totally.
So if so the sort of thing that might happen is that if the HALE Index was targeted, then people might be out there trying to get the measurements of depression down, and you might do that in a way that didn't get depression down.
Yeah. Lying with statistics.
Yeah. So that's all I can say. But it's pretty benign in the sense that it looks for the big problems of GDP and then it just tries to correct them. And I think the other thing is that to measure education, that's a hard thing to do. We're not really measuring the quality of education. There were one or two things, I'm just trying to remember what they are. So the PISA process, which is an international benchmarking process, has some pretensions to measuring educational outputs as opposed to inputs. So it'll tell you how successful we've been in teaching numeracy and literacy and so on. But it's crude.
But the problem is, how are you measuring that success? It's funny.
Exactly,
it's
and we've
a
done that
circle.
already with NAPLAN.
Yeah.
So we have all these teachers teaching to the test, and that's done lots of damage. It's essentially one of the most fundamental things it's done is it's undermined the intrinsic motivation of teachers.
It seems like that's kind of circuitous. You'll invent a new way to measure something, and then you realize the way that's been measured has been gamified and not actually solving the underlying problem. Like, how do you defeat that? Can you overcome that?
You can't overcome it. You can acknowledge the problem, and the best philosopher I know of to write about this is a guy called Alistair McIntyre, and he distinguishes between what he calls internal goods and external goods. Internal goods he talks about the internal goods of a practice. So the way he introduces the topic is to talk about teaching a young girl to play chess. And the young girl, to give her an interest, the young girl's offered candy if she wins a game. And that's an external motivation. And the candy is an external good. And the internal good of chess is accuracy in calculation, spatial visualization, competitive intensity. These are things which, to be good at chess, you need to get good at those things. And then if you want to be serious about a practice, because he's really writing about accountancy and government and business and all these other things, if you want to dedicate a substantial amount of your life and other people's lives to these practices, to doing these things, you've got to go and get external goods, money, prestige, and so on. And McIntyre's argument is that these two worlds are in tension with each other. Money, you can always cut some corners to make some money, and that undermines the intrinsic value of what you're doing. And so I think that's an incredibly powerful idea. And I don't know whether we're going to talk about public and private goods in some time down the line, but that's an idea that modernity is kind of driven out of our world. And of course, it's not an easy thing to deal with. You can't build an institution that will make sure that everyone does a good job. And so you're playing with incentives, extrinsic motivations, in order to try to get people to do a good job. Super hard. What's happened in our world is that we've kind of ignored the fact that if you want people to do a good job, they have to buy in. They have to want to do a good job, and then these metrics might be helpful to structure it and so on.
Do you think like these surmounting problems explains why there's much more of a sense of individualism? Like, a nihilistic look at the institutions around you and realize, look, I just got to look after myself here. I'm going to do whatever I can for myself.
Absolutely.
And if you're good-hearted and good-natured, you'll do your best, once you've made the money.
Well, if you're good-hearted and good-natured, you'll be taken advantage of.
No, hopefully not. That gets quite cynical quite quickly, though.
No, but that's why.
That's at the top of the tree. That's your Musks. That's your Bezos.
It's in school tuck shops. It's everywhere. That's human morality. Is about are you going to... Absolutely. I'm not saying there are kind of super predators everywhere. I'm saying that these norms of good behaviour are quite fluid over time, and it's kind of understood that if you're in a bureaucracy and you just notice that you're trying to do the right thing and people grab hold of your capacity to work well and work hard and and exploit it, well, that's a pretty good way to think, hang on, I'm getting something wrong here. So a person who you're not asked, these people are not saints in this position. These people start off as normal human beings. We call that idealistic, but they also want to look after their own interests. That's what you expect that. But they learn. I mean, a lot of people will try and do the right thing and think that their interests will be looked after. And they learn that that's really a little bit naive and a bit dumb in our world. So they learn, and it's bruising, and it undermines their sense of doing their best. That's where I would say that that this mental health crisis is real to some extent. And so they undermine it for themselves. They train themselves that doing the right thing is being a mug, so they dial that down. But of course, that is within an organisation, people's preparedness to help each other out, that's a public good. That's a shared good. Yeah. So the whole thing goes down a notch and down a notch. So these things are very delicate, and they're incredibly important, and they're not thought about.
This, about the Rorschach test?
Do. There's some good. I don't know. Do you know the 1960s sitcom Get Smart? Okay.
I think it's the Clown Spy, right?
The Carell remake. That's right. He's being interviewed by a psychiatrist, and he shows in the Rorschach test, and he says that's a man and a woman kissing, and then he shows him another one and he says, well, that's a man and a woman doing more than kissing, and then he shows him another one and he says, well, I can't even say what that is, and the psychiatrist says to him, well, you seem to be preoccupied with sex, Maxwell Smart. And Maxwell Smart says, well, you're the one with the dirty picture.
But underneath that, you're presented with two ink blots and you see one thing or you see another thing as some sort of indication of where your biases are. This, were the HALE Index to replace the GDP, would also become an opportunity for different policymakers according to how they perceive the Rorschach test. Yeah. All of a sudden it's like, okay, now this is the one that I'm going to pin my hat to.
Yeah. You've asked for mistakes, and I'm not sure what the mistakes are, but let me just totally change your question and say, imagine you've asked me what would the good things be.
Yeah.
So what the good things would be is, let's imagine that we thought that depression, anxiety, starts young, that it's got something to do with social media, that it's got something to do with the powerlessness of kids in institutions that don't think about them, that don't try to put their interests first, not their wishes first, but their interests first. Another one is that we are remarkably bad at teaching dyslexic kids. Now, it's tricky to teach dyslexic kids, but it's by no means. We could, if we were actually thinking about impact on well-being, and one of the things that the HALE Index allows you to do is to say, here's an improvement in well-being and that is worth this amount of dollars, then we would really pay attention to these kinds of pedagogical issues, and people would be interested. How, I don't know what the proportion of kids are dyslexic, but from mild to severe, it's sort of between 10 or 2% or something. It's quite substantial. Well, they're going to feel a lot better about themselves. They're going to understand themselves a lot better. And of course, Richard Branson's an example. I would say Paul Keating is an example, but he might sue me if I said that, because he got a book pulped for saying that. But
really?
Yeah. Because a book came out saying he was dyslexic and he got it pulped. But these are remarkable people, but they're different. Mm-hmm. And they're a great asset, and that's an incredible thing that we could try and bring out. Mm-hmm. So that's a good thing that could come from the index. There are lots of things that if we connected up measurements of well-being to actual things we can do. I'll give you another example, because I've got this running disagreement with most people who are out there spruiking well-being measures, and they're not connecting them to any concrete things to do. But if you're measuring people's subjective well-being and you're saying that someone on average wages, if we increase that by 1%, that's worth, I think it's $14,000 a year, okay? You then look around for low-hanging fruit. Remember how I don't know whether you do remember, but at the beginning of the greenhouse adventure, when people started saying we've got to do something about greenhouse, the very first thing they said was, let's find things that we will call no regrets measures. That is, things we can do that lower greenhouse emissions that don't cost any money, but that in fact save money, okay? Now, there are plenty of those things we can do in social policy, and I'll give you an example. I can't prove this. This is the sort of thing that you would go and prove up if you took any of this seriously. But it's well known that single elderly people who've become carers of their spouse, their well-being plummets because they get socially isolated and it becomes very difficult for them. So the idea is there are quite low-cost ways, and possibly, well, arguably with all the effects it would have on well-being, very negative cost ways of engaging those people. Once someone is a carer for an older person, you engage them in a series of local initiatives that keep them in touch and so on. My wife built a program called I Wish I'd Asked, which connected up primary schools and aged care homes, in which these people, the people in aged care homes can tell their stories to the young kids, and the young kids can write up oral histories and so on. These things are massively positive. Yeah. They're massive. They're cheap and massively positive. Right. Is anyone doing any of this stuff? Right. Well, they are. They're doing it in tiny little pockets. Yeah. But nobody has said, hey, let's try and make some of those things happen. Let's make them happen at a big scale. So those are the types of things that might be done to get a well-being agenda going and get the community to say, hey, that's pretty cool, rather than our betters have told us that we've got a new way of measuring well-being. I mean, really. Right. They're just going to go, really? I mean, a bit more propaganda, a few more TV ads.
Mm-hmm. This was actually something I really wanted to ask you regarding that point. This is a great theoretical program where the elderly will tell the young about their life story, and then they have to write up an oral history of it. Yeah. But actually, what are the mechanisms that have to happen for this theoretical idea to become public policy? Yeah. Like, can you take us through that?
Sure. So firstly, that's not the idea. That's an illustration of the idea.
Right.
So to do it, you would get the kids and you get the older people and you say, look, we've got a half an idea here. Mm-hmm. which is roughly what my wife Eva did. And in fact, what happened was that I Wish I'd Asked, which was a program that was built in Shepparton, it had 14 streams. It had dancing, gardening, storytelling, philosophy, and it had these these multi-generational cadre of people who, it was fabulous. It was a fabulous thing. What needs to happen? A degree of funding, not a lot of funding, then what I call accessing vectors of enthusiasm. Okay. So you're not saying I'm rolling out this, it's a national program, every child will tell its story to an oldie or vice versa. You say we are in a social capital starved society. It's not that hard to build these things. They're a little bit artificial because we're used to this idea of a long chat over the back fence, which hasn't even happened in my lifetime, really. I mean, that was kind of back in the 50s and the 30s.
When you have TV to occupy you all day.
Exactly. So we're going to do something that's a little bit artificial. No one's going to have to do it if they don't want to. We will. So the politicians could say, we'd like these kinds of things to happen. If you need our help, if there's regulation getting in the way, if you want a bit of funding, we'll help with that. We will hold ourselves accountable. So you set up some process, not a very heavy-handed process, but some process which will generate objective information and it will go out to the community. Why would you do that? To give the politicians and the bureaucrats sweaty palms so that they can fail or succeed. But if they build the system of reporting, they will airbrush that out because that's uncomfortable.
Right.
So you sort of build this skeleton and then you say, we're going to give prizes out and local councils will give them some money for where the best 10 or 100 of these exercises have been. You build stuff. You build stuff slowly and you build it with the people who are...
So because of the effort of the people who come up with the idea, they get a couple of test cases at a couple of nursing homes and a couple of schools, and you show, look, everyone's saying they love this. Looks like it works. Here's a rough idea for what it might cost for, say, this region of Victoria. And then...
But but you're still thinking of it from the top down.
Yeah.
I'm growing it from the bottom up.
But it's just like how, because I'm underneath the question is, how many roadblocks get in the way of these great ideas?
So starting in a bottom-up way and understanding that there will be roadblocks, then you build the program to uncover the roadblocks and then give some people some sweaty palms, give some people some problems. So their problem isn't, oh, gee, what do I say on the 7:30 report about the interest rates going up or something? They'll have to, if they've got to handle that, they'll have to handle that. I said that I wanted more of this sort of stuff to happen. There's, Shepparton are happy and Echuca are happy and nothing's happening in Wangaratta and they're blaming me for that. And now the people who are in charge of child safety are saying that they want everyone to have a police check, but the people who are really successful at doing this in Shepparton and Echuca say that massively harms their number of volunteers, and they've got an alternative way to keep kids safe from pedophiles. So have these people seriously considered that? It's building and bug fixing. Well, it's that you don't start with the end all stitched up.
You don't
just
start with a national policy.
We don't know what the fuck we're doing here. So this is like turning up in Sydney in 1788 saying, who are they?
But these inescapable roadblocks towards creating new, whether you call this a policy or just an initiative or whatever, is that partly explicable for why there is just a stagnation for new policies and initiatives?
I think so. Yeah.
Same old again and again and again because it's just too much effort to try and overcome.
Well, there's another set of resources there are resources in schools. Now, schools have got a lot of resources. You can say they should have more, but they've got a lot of resources. We're constantly throwing responsibilities on them, teach this, teach that, and you're saying, hey, it'd be good for schools to start doing this now. And here is some money and some grants for you to, A, apply for, but B, I'm a bit more of a fan of picking these things up after the event, after you've shown some success. So you say, the government says here's $10 million, which is a rounding error in the budget. It's just nothing to get too fussed about. And then you say, and then you say schools that get their act together will get some of this money, and then you're redirecting the energy, the institutional energies of Australia, of the school system, back out into the community to draw it into the school system. So the school will then, if this is functioning properly, the school will then say, we should build oral history into our history curriculum or our social studies curriculum or stuff like that. So it's not the idea that you've got a brand new program that is a big spanking new program that you go on to telly and take credit for. It is that we've got a problem, and our problem is that we've got very siloed institutions. Maybe 80% of what they do should be siloed, or 90% of what they do should be siloed, but absolutely the other 5 or 10% shouldn't be. That should be about connections. And we've made those connections virtually impossible. So a school, I know of another example of a school who wanted to buy a vineyard next door and build a whole educational curriculum around vineyards. But to do that, the vineyard had a whole bunch of occupational health and safety regulations, and it just goes on, and it becomes too hard and people give it away.
Insurmountable.
Well, ultimately insurmountable.
Yeah.
Ultimately insurmountable. And when you're trying to do something as an innovator, you have the collected resources of government. What is that now? Maybe $800 billion a year. To pay people full-time to receive your correspondence, to come meet with you, say it's just terrific what you're doing.
Right.
We've got this problem with police checks. Yes, you've got a problem with police. We'll go and talk to some other people about that, and we'll be back in touch with you. So nothing is happening, but the meter's being cranked over.
Yeah.
So you're trying to say to these institutions, this is your job. And it's mostly teaching kids in classrooms, but it's also connecting that to the world. And it's also listening to people who have different ideas. And if you want to knock them back, that's fine too. But have a piece of paper or have a process where you say, yeah, we heard that person, we're quite impressed with what they're doing. We went down that path and we decided we couldn't do it.
And what you're suggesting is all that due diligence is not happening.
Of course it's not. Of course it's not happening. Absolutely not happening. And to get it to happen, decades go past. I can tell you, here am I, I'm the decades. Nothing happens, but people tell you it's terrific that you're doing this stuff. Yeah. It's woeful. It's a shocking story. It's a shocking business.
Yeah. How much of it is the problem of just the scale of 20 million people? You know what I mean? So, for instance, if we were 5 million people, do you think our institutions would all be functioning way better? And these types of the due diligence you gave on the Shepparton School for this great person coming in and following up on how the project was going and how it was good and who the constituents are that they can then spread it to. Like it'd be more likely with a small population.
Maybe, but look, we've got to take seriously this problem that as systems get bigger, you have to put more effort into having those systems hear people. It's not so the best example I can give you for this is the Toyota production system, in which they revolutionized car production, and they did that by building a system around workers on the line and supplying companies. And all of the systems that they learned from, the American systems, had the thinking staff at the top, managers and designers and engineers, and then all the doing staff below that. And what Toyota showed is that you can build a system. It's it's a beautiful system, and it's not, you can't just issue commands. You can't just say things like our people are our greatest resource and dust off the hands and walk off, But you can build a system in which people feel empowered to identify bugs, to identify opportunities to improve, and to have managers regard themselves as largely responsible for facilitating the desire to do a good job of the people lower down. And that's possible. It's not perfectly possible, but it's massively more possible than we have today. And in fact, there are some metrics that can bear on that. So, for instance, in the State of the Service report, which is a questionnaire that is administered to all public servants. I can't remember what the nature of the question is now, but it's something like, I think I'm well managed, or if I came up with an innovative idea, it would be taken seriously. I think you might want to develop that quite a lot more, but we get that data and then we suppress it. We don't publish it agency by agency.
Why is that? Because they don't like what it says?
Sound chaps. Yeah. We'll have a chat with them. We don't want all these problems coming out.
Maybe they misunderstood the question.
Well, whatever. It's uncomfortable.
And there's cultural differences, obviously, with Japan and Toyota, but presumably
there aren't. So, of course, Japanese culture is very different to Western culture, and it may be the case that the Toyota production system couldn't have been produced in the West. But we've had controlled experiments over your question, because the factory in which Teslas are made today was first built by General Motors, and it was in California, so it was away from it's called the NUMMI plant. It was away from Detroit, and I think they were going to build their ill-fated Saturn car there, and it was a sort of utopian, this is all going to be perfect. It was the worst plant in the General Motors network, and they joint ventured with Toyota to build a badge engineer. I think it was Corollas and Saturns or whatever it was, I'm not sure. It was Corollas and rebadged Corollas, I believe. And Toyota were told by Americans, well, now you'll see how tough it is to interact with our workers and our unions. And very quickly, the NUMMI plant became easily the most productive in the GM network, but it later on became one of the more productive, not the most productive, but one of the more productive and higher quality plants anywhere in Toyota's world. What does that tell you?
With the lesson being that the culture isn't important there, it's rather the way the system is designed.
Well, indeed, but it also might tell you that if you want to make it a cultural explanation, then Japanese managers are better at managing a situation like that. But really, I don't know whether you have to say that. There are I can show you some terrific talks by American engineers, because when you see this, you go, my God, this is extraordinary. This is wonderful. I remember encountering it in 1983 when I was working for John Button on the car plan, and I just couldn't believe it. It was this transformation. And what has shocked me ever since is that economists have never taken any interest in it. Economists just say, that's a rightward shift of the supply curve. A supply curve is this curve of the cost of production over against volume. And if it moves right, that means that you've had a positive productivity shock. Well, that doesn't tell you anything about how you did it. And economists just haven't interested themselves in it because their discipline doesn't allow them to ask the interesting questions, which are not questions that metrication can be very, very powerful in understanding.
And the interesting questions you want to get to the bottom of is, what actually is it about these systems that produce these different outcomes, not just the singular metrics?
That's right. And in fact, there's a marvelous quote from a guy, quite a famous guy, who's an American who stayed behind after the war in Japan and worked with Toyota. And he was a statistical control guy called Edwards Deming. And he said, and what had happened was that Toyota had built their production facilities by visiting Ford and writing down what they did and learning from what they did and reading Henry Ford's advice about always driving out waste and stuff like that. And so when the Americans finally accepted that they had something to learn, because they spent most of their time saying, the Japanese are dumping, they're just subsidising, they can't possibly have done all this. Eventually the Americans, tail between their legs, come over, and Edwards Deming said words to the effect of, the Americans come, they bring their notebooks, they write everything down, and then they go home and try to copy what we've done, but they don't know what to copy. And it's a socio-technical system. It's built on respect. It's built on the respect due to a person working on the line.
Hierarchy.
Yeah. And you could say that's having lunch with someone today who was saying that's a very Japanese thing, but it's entirely transferable. Nobody on the line doesn't want respect. But the Japanese understood that they could build a massive surge of productivity around respecting the people who were there and who knew this stuff. And it's those sort of thoughts that I'm appealing to when I'm talking about improving the teaching of dyslexia and, multi-generational programs in Shepparton and so on. It's the same kind of thing. That you are trying to show respect to the people at the bottom and you'll be rewarded for that. You can't exactly know how or why.
And then there's all these intangibles about how people might feel about the community that they're involved in. And for their other HALE indexes, their quality of life, their sort of overall satisfaction, maybe their relationships with other people. But
if you want to do difficult things, try to do something difficult and measure yourself against, say it's a being happy. I think we should be thinking of being happy as a byproduct. Trying to be happy is a good way to be not happy.
Right, exactly.
So if you are in Shepparton and you do something really tricky, which is to take disadvantaged kids and show that here's a saxophonist and here's someone who's done some amazing data science or some drawing or something, that's an anchor. It's not something which it's not something which depends for its validation on people feeling nice about something. You go, holy shit, did they do that? They did, and they feel good about that. Playing football's an example.
I'm thinking now about time and also maybe triaging. You wanted to go economics into politics.
I don't mind. I
think actually the right way to go from economics into politics, actually I don't even think it's possible. I think we just sift between the two.
Okay, whatever.
Do you want to do the Australian scorecard or the McDonald?
I won't. I don't think I'll have anything much useful to say about the Australian scorecard because it's not really a way I think.
But it'll be just nice to hear your quick thoughts about it. Should we do that?
Sure, if you want.
Okay, so I asked one of the big LLMs to give me a scorecard for Australia. And then, many of the follow-ups I was asking how it fared against the rest of the world. So high level, according to this LLM, we have one of the most desirous countries in the world, which isn't a surprise to all these metrics. So economic strength, 30 years of uninterrupted growth. This is the problem with GDP, but still, it's
that's
good.
GDP, not GDP per capita.
Low government to debt GDP, which is a good factor. AAA credit rating, not sure what that means.
Just a high credit rating.
Right. Natural resources available to us, naturally. Mm-hmm. And then a really good superannuation system. Would you say it is world-class, that personal saving system that we've got?
No. It's very unusual, and I've gradually grown more and more deeply out of love with it. So what's good about it is that, there are a few terrible things about it. The worst thing about it, I was there when it was first built in the Labor government, in the Hawke and Keating governments, and as I recall, the very first bit of it, which would have occurred around about 1984-85, was the beginning of the superannuation system, and they had a fairly equitable taxation system on the super system, and then the insurance, the pensions. The superannuation managers, the wealth management business. And as I recall, the New South Wales trades unions, led by Barry Unsworth at that stage, he went on to become Premier, objected to the way in which higher earning employees would be taxed more than they wanted to. And so they imposed a 15% flat tax on everyone. Hard to imagine a less fair taxation system, which is now, you'll have to remind me, I think it's $3.5 trillion or something.
The value of the funds, more or less.
So here we have this vast body of resources that we have what I regard a very unfair tax system around.
Because it's blanket 15% for
exactly.
everyone.
And we occasionally put some Band-Aids on that. The Liberals Scott Morrison put a bit of a Band-Aid on that for higher income earners. The current government has just got in and they will put a bit of a Band-Aid on that. But the system is unfair. the system is extremely expensive in terms of revenue foregone. I think it costs, I mean, it depends how you calculate these things, but certainly, well, I'm now quoting propaganda from people who are arguing against
Quote
it.
away.
Yeah, well, that it costs more. It's more expensive than the pension system.
Yeah.
Just these tax concessions, which go mostly to wealthy people. So that's a terrible thing. It's also, so the other thing is that astonishing thing happens, which is that we take money off people at the time of their lives when they need to invest in a house.
Right. It'd be best
and
to
we
spend
don't
it now.
say, oh, by the way, we're forcing you to save, but some of that saving or all of that saving for the time being could go into buying a house. Of course, you should be able to do that. It's so unbelievably inefficient to not do that. But instead, we get these little pat lines about how it would increase house prices. Well, yes, allowing people to buy houses increases house prices. You know, we allow people to buy houses in every other damn way.
But then we also have a lot of tax concessions for first home buyers.
Well, we don't. State tax.
I'm currently trying to buy
Yeah.
my first house, and I know that if I purchase one under $800,000, then I get a stamp duty for free.
That's right. Well, that's a state tax.
When there's probably a lot more room for those types of incentives to maybe offset the increase in the house price if we're letting our superannuation contribute to a house price.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
what's happening now is that, you know, a rich buyer can come in and bid $20,000, $30,000 over my offer because they already have 3 investment properties.
Yeah.
And it's just rent for them.
That's
they
right.
just go on
That's
and
right.
put it as Airbnb.
So there's all that. And the other thing is, it's quite good that the system allows private investment, not just, I mean, a lot of superannuation systems are basically government bonds and they're lower return, but the way in which our super is managed creates it's many billions of dollars too expensive, and you could get the same managing.
Expensive because of the fees?
Yes. So there's that, and there's one other thing which will no doubt come to me.
Because it's private saving, there is no collective use for that huge pool of money. Could be a negative way to look at the superannuation.
Oh, yeah, well, I know you've written about that, and we could talk about that, but no, that's not what I was going to say. But it was just coming into my head, and you chased it out.
Let him fly around for a bit, and it'll come back.
Yeah, this is the other thing. So something like a third, this is just wild. Something like a third, and don't quote me on this, you know, it might be, well, you can quote me, but it's not guaranteed to be exactly accurate. Something like a third of the pool of savings is in self-managed super funds. And of course you want to manage those self-managed super funds so that people aren't ripping off the system and that people aren't doing things with their savings which is so risky that they then end up back on the public purse.
Don't put in Bitcoin.
And we have put a regulatory regime there that is simply extraordinary. So we took the regulatory regime that we would impose on $1 billion wealth fund. We have trustees involved. We then cut that down. Each of these funds is audited every year. They're audited in a way that is bizarrely anal retentive, if you like. They have to comply with about 20 different subsections of the Act.
For where they can put the money?
No, not with it, but just how they audit. So if let's say you're trying to audit some money, you're trying to audit a fund and the fund paid a fee of, you know, 0.25% of its corpus to somebody, and it's going to take you a long time to prove that it was, you know, your auditor is you're racking up lots of bills because a payment that might have been rounded up in the accounting software can't be accounted for, and so there are 2 columns that can't be reconciled, and there's a difference of $2.30 or something. Oh, well, that's not good enough. Then you just have to keep going and spend more and more money doing this kind of stuff. None of this is necessary. What's necessary is that you set up a system you set up a system which asks the sort of questions that our tax system asks, which is this person ripping off the system? Are we getting proper declaration of these just really simple stuff, and then you get people to declare that they've followed the rules, and then they know that they might have a random audit. They might have someone come after them. That would cost, the current auditing of a self-managed super fund costs maybe $5,000 a year for just a normal family fund. It ought to cost $150 or whatever to just sort of make sure that things are ticking over. And here's the kicker, that it doesn't actually protect people, because at the same time, if you can dress up some product like macadamia farms and you can sell it to someone, then it can go in there. It doesn't matter how risky it is.
And by dressing it up, you just meet these auditory requirements.
Exactly. You just turn it into a financial product, and if someone is so there are cases of this. I'll send you an article. There are cases of this where a woman who got a huge payout for being made paraplegic or something like that, and she put an investment advisor comes along and says, well, you should put this into macadamia farms, or whatever he said. And the thing fell over. Too bad. Right. Too bad, too sad. The system didn't help her. She would have been paying $5,000 a year to have it audited. And the auditor would come along and say, yep, those macadamia farms.
The way they justify those huge auditing costs and that huge auditing burden is that we're setting really, really strict investing rules on these super funds, so they're very safe. And
that's what a politician would say, but the thing is, this is just confirming that these investments exist, that they have paid what you claim they've paid. This is all expensive. So if you're told that this person has shares in BHP Billiton, then you can spend a lot of money auditing that. You can ask to see the certificates, although you can't see certificates anymore.
So suggesting there is some grift from these auditors and their relationship with the superannuation?
No, not suggesting grift.
Or just pure inefficiency and expensive bureaucracy?
They have requirements they have to do. It's called a SIS audit. SIS stands for Superannuation something system. I don't know what it is. And there are about 20. You can read it in my article. And they have to do all these things. So there's no grift. It's a collective standard. It's not really, and it's partly regulation that set it up, but it's also standard practice. And for a $1 billion super fund, it might be the best you can do. It's absolutely not the best you can do. It's simply never been designed in a way that was fit for purpose, and yet it's been going on for over 20 years. And because it's got that word audit in it, if you go out into the marketplace and say, hey, guys, this is really stupid, then a politician's going to say, well, I'd look very carefully at any proposal to remove audit.
Look how strict this audit is.
Funds. Yeah, absolute. You just have to pay attention and do a bit of auditing yourself, auditing the argument, and it just falls to pieces.
But then what can be done? Because despite that big problem,
you can rebuild this. And it would be, any Teals members out there, you'd like to think backbenchers of every party would be interested in this. You can save many small businesses in the country $5,000 a year. To give you an example, when Penny Wong was Minister for Finance and, don't laugh, deregulation, there was a recommendation, I think from a parliamentary committee, saying that if you had an audit done, then it should normally be the case that you're not asked to do another audit for another 3 years. And I'm pretty sure that didn't get up, and you would be nice to ask why. But it just didn't get up because it's a detail. No one's going to do a 7:30 report on it. But it's just $100 bills lying on the pavement for someone who's got a little bit of attention to detail.
And the success, rather, at least on paper, rhetoric success of the superannuation fund, I don't want to trigger you into saying that it's super successful, is a major bulwark against potential policy which would introduce a type of sovereign wealth fund for our huge natural resource bounty that we have extracting from the ground every single day. Doing more with that income than just spending it on state and national budgets that year.
Well,
I suppose when the argument is presented, they'll say, but this superannuation fund already is this multi-generational savings system, even though maybe for several reasons it might not be.
Well, I think it does give us a lot. There's a lot of capital in Australia hunting around for opportunities. I think that's a good thing. So, and in some ways that addresses your sovereign wealth anxiety, if I can put it that way. So that's a plus. I think my hunch is, I can't prove this, but my hunch is that that's one of the reasons why Australia has outperformed New Zealand, because it doesn't have a pot of capital sitting around chasing good targets to invest in as we do. So there are some benefits. I'm more focused on the unfairness of it. The other thing is that I think we should use compulsion or tax concessions, not both. We've used both. We compel people to save, and then we give them a tax concession, which is an unfair tax concession. But if we're going to compel them to save, why give them a tax concession at all?
Right.
So that's my go-to system, a system which is like the current one, that is after tax and that makes exceptions for people's need to dip into their savings to lead their lives. For instance, you're buying a house.
Yeah, rather than wait till I'm 65 and I've got $2 million in superannuation, plus a lifetime of earning a salary. It's like not necessarily.
And there is a grift there. It's just why you can't do it, because everyone's clipping the ticket on the super that you've got invested. If you took it out and put it in a house,
yes,
no
exactly.
one's clipping the ticket.
Right,
and that's one of the reasons why it's much more efficient.
Yeah, okay. Returning to the scorecard, robust democracy, that's true. Transparent institutions.
No, it's more robust than others, but it's in some trouble. But yeah, we've done this marvellous thing of having a because we've got compulsory voting and preferential voting. The compulsory voting means that politicians depart from the centre at their peril, and preferential voting allows a nice hybrid between proportional representation, which has some good things and some bad things, and single member electorates. What it allows is that people can start another party or another, it doesn't have to be a party, it can be an independent candidate, and they can pick up votes and people get a second vote. In other words, I vote for Monique Ryan. I mean, I'm not in that seat, but I vote for Monique Ryan in Kooyong. He doesn't get up, I'll vote for the Greens or the Labor Party or whoever. And now you can't do that in the UK, you can't do that in most parts of the United States, and that's awful. Or Canada. It's amazing that Canada is comparable to us in having a functioning democracy, because its basic voting system is incredibly unfair.
Do you mention that because it's compulsory voting, that politicians straying from the centre beware?
Yeah.
Do you think there's also a nice counterfactual to that, which is that it might keep populism at bay as much as possible, because everyone eventually has to go to the polls, and rather than just electrifying people to make them go out and the rest of the people that couldn't be fucked stay home.
That's right. Yeah. Exactly. It's a reasonable argument. In some circumstances, I would be influenced by it. But ultimately, I think most of these arguments, you also have to think about the effects of different options. And it's a reasonable argument to say, what the hell are we doing forcing people to vote? Now, I've got a bunch of things to say about that. But one is, you know that Monty Python sketch, What Did the Romans Ever Do for Us? One of the things the Romans did for us is they invented the census. And the census tells you that you, as a citizen, have certain obligations to the centre, and you have an obligation to provide it with information. And so I don't think it's so unreasonable, in return for schooling and all of the public goods the government has, to say to people, we're going to take an hour of your time once every 3 years. I don't think that's such a terrible idea.
It seems like a reasonable trade-off.
It sounds like a reasonable trade-off. And if that doesn't get you, then another way to put this is to say that you can think of compulsory voting. Firstly, it's not compulsory voting, it's compulsory attendance at the polling booth, as you said, because people can vote. They can draw a dick pic on their ballot or do whatever they want. But another way to think about it is to say that we could pay everyone $70 for attending the polling booth because they're doing something good for democracy, but that's expensive. It would be better to fine them $70 for not attending. That's what we do on the roads. We don't pay people money for driving well. We punish them for not driving well. For driving badly. So one way to think about a $70 fine for not attending the polling booth is as a negative poll tax. You familiar with the term poll tax? No. So poll taxes were used particularly, I think, in the South during the Jim Crow era, and you would not be eligible to vote if you hadn't paid your tax. And that was hugely unfair to poor people because it was a poll tax. It was a unit tax. Everybody had to pay it. Say it was $100 or $2,000, and that's obviously very unfair for a poor person. So this is a negative poll tax. It says that if you don't vote, you get hit with a poll tax. It's not I don't think that's such an imposition.
There already is a fine if you don't vote, though, I believe.
And that's how I'm choosing to characterise it, as a negative poll tax. That's my point. It's a saying to people, if you don't vote, here's a tax. This is a tax reflecting the fact that you wouldn't give us information that we need to govern the place.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Universal healthcare, Medicare, we get a good score for this.
Mm-hmm.
Among the highest life expectancies, great score.
Yep.
High, same point. World-class universities, 100%, right?
Maybe.
New South Wales and Uni, ANU.
Maybe. I mean, there's good things there. I think of universities as kind of careerist ant heaps, but there you go.
Okay. But what about for the graduates that are going there, you know?
Well,
because like
they're okay.
The professors and the students experience university very differently.
Let me give you an example. Somebody came up to me, he was a PhD student in economics, and I gave a speech. I was giving a speech launching a memoirs of Max Corden, who's a well-known Australian economist who's no longer with us. And he came up to me and said, look, I'm an economist. Would you like, be nice to catch up with you and get, pick your brain and so on. So I said, good. And we organised to have lunch, and, we basically spent our time talking about ideas for an hour and a half, 2 hours. And then off he went. And he said to me, it's amazing, but I've never had a conversation like this at university. Mm. So universities used to be about ideas, and now they are, they go charging around trying to get money any way they can. Mm. They chase metrics, and it's very clear, certainly in all the professions I know anything about, that you won't get good metrics if you try to do if you try to develop new and difficult ideas. Mm. You work within the frameworks that you've been given. There will be a realist school and an idealist school or some such nonsense, and you just pump this stuff out. But I was just shocked when he said to me, I just don't have these conversations at uni. Well, I certainly did, and that's a big change that's come over uni. They're a big thing that they understand themselves as these custodians of a process of giving you a certificate and taking you through a process, and it's not really about a liberal education.
This was a fellow professor, not a student.
This was a person who was doing a PhD and was finishing his PhD.
Do you think his comment, though, could just be more of a reflection of the fact that he was having it with you rather than... Because I just couldn't imagine, a PhD student isn't... maybe not constantly, but quite routinely being excited about, what are you writing
absolutely
about?
Not. No, absolutely not, because they're a PhD student in economics and they're learning one econometric technique after another. That's what they're doing the whole time.
And they're not intrigued by, the geopolitical world order and applying all their education to trying to make sense of it.
There's no way to apply your knowledge to that. If you want to get a PhD, you've got to find a little area in which you can do some econometrics that will be received as some new insight into an established field. So that's economics. And it's true of a large number of these areas. They're kind of deracinated. In economics, it's all about teaching techniques. In some other areas, they go, I don't know whether you had a look at this. I wrote a piece for the Institute for New Economics in which I talked about metaphysical fairy floss. So you get told by an economist that health policy is necessarily about trade-offs. Well, that makes someone feel like they're doing economics. And then they say you can go for income, you can go for good health, and you can go for equity, and those things all trade off against each other. Well, pig's arse, they trade off against each other. This is exactly the analytical framework that you would apply to buying, whether you buy apples or oranges at the market. That you've got a limited budget, you've got these things that exist, and you trade them off against each other. That's not true. At the time this person was asserting this framework as if it was kind of metaphysically true, we were going through COVID. Does that show you that health and income are in tension with each other? No. There's a relationship which is a kind of elaborate relationship. Yes, there will be times when you can trade one off against the other. There will be lots of times when the two things reinforce each other. Healthy workers are better workers.
Yeah.
It's all obvious. And yet, if you go and do health economics, some clown will stand up on the board and show you this diagram.
Right.
It's just bullshit. Because they can't be bothered thinking, but it's easy to kind of get some trope out of the core of the discipline and then bore everyone to death with a kind of point that is ultimately obvious or wrong.
And frame it as a big discovery.
Yeah, exactly. And frame it as a kind of organising concept.
Right. Which we can now create institutions around.
Yeah.
Is that one of your most radical ideas, the problem you have with trade-offs, that it's the worst thing economics ever taught people?
No. I have a dear friend, Rory Sutherland, who takes me to be saying that. And I'm not really saying that. I'm saying that there is loads of interest in relationships, and often in relationships between different metrics, and often you can say that things are presumptively in tension with each other.
The core of the idea, whether it is attributed to or not, or Rory's just making it such that it's attributed to, is that we're thinking about trade-offs as always sum zero. And that's not the case.
So the example that I use in that article that Rory loves is that it's Toyota again. And everyone knew that you could have high quality or low cost, that quality was costly. And at the time when I encountered the Toyota production system, this thing jumped out at me, and the best way to convey it to you is with a factoid. And that factoid is that in 83, when I was doing this, on the Australian car market, the two cars that had the highest build quality were the Mercedes-Benz 350 SLE, available to you for about $150,000, which was a lot more than it is now. It would cost a lot more now, the equivalent. And the other car was a Toyota Corolla. And why was the Toyota Corolla such high build quality? Because doing all of the 90,000 operations that go into building a car had been conceptualized by Toyota as an engineering problem involving people getting it right first time. And the Mercedes-Benz 350 SLE was the highest build quality car in the world, made in Germany, I think Stuttgart, I'm not sure about that. And that was because it had more inspectors on the line per car than any other place in the world. And Toyota had no inspectors on the line. There were no inspectors on the line. What there was andon cords. And if a problem arose, then the worker would try to fix the problem, and if it couldn't be fixed, he would pull the andon cord, or she would pull the andon cord, and the whole factory would stop. And that sets up a set of incentives for getting it right first time, and nobody can hide. As Warren Buffett says, it's when the tide goes out that you can see who's been swimming naked. And so that was what it was about. And so...
also, you might feel more empowered that you have the responsibility to try and fix it yourself without needing to involve other people.
Correct. And but the point was, again, it's my bottom-up point. It was building from the bottom up, empowering the people at the bottom. And remember earlier I said that, as Edwards Deming said, American managers came over and they copied everything, or they wrote everything down, and then when they went back to America, they said, well, we'll put in and-on courts. So they put in and-on courts, and all the workers online say, I don't think you
I'm
really
too
want me
scared to pull that.
I don't think you
Yeah.
want me to pull that. No, they say,
Yeah.
you pull the and-on court. And they said, no, I don't think we'll do that. And eventually, you know, lots of cultural this and that's, somebody pulls the and-on court and there's complete mayhem.
And they get one of them
Some,
because
lots
they're
of
the
people
one that
get
pulled the
fired.
end-on
Who
cord.
know whose
Yeah.
idea was this anyway? You
Yeah.
know, so that's that. There are always these things, and there are lots of them. You just have to look around, take these things seriously, and sort of ask. Again, it's a bit of a Rory Sutherland question. You know, just look at what's happening and say, is the description I've got of what's happening really what's happening?
Right.
you
Yeah,
know,
he's so good at reframing problem.
so the doorman comes to me and he lets me in he opens the door for me. And as Rory will point out, that a management consultant will think of that as a cost and he
They
won't
need to resize.
Exactly. and Rory's showing you the social richness of all this.
All those intangibles which
Yeah,
are
that's right.
immeasurable. Like you
That's
can't
right.
measure
That's
that.
right.
And you're not
That's
going to
right.
stand there with a clipboard and say 1 to 10. How much
Yeah.
did you enjoy the fact
Yeah.
that the doors are?
Yeah.
I didn't even realize.
Yeah,
You know,
that's
it
right.
just sat in the
That's
back
right.
of my head and I have
That's
a positive association with this thing afterwards. Yeah, I have internalized, well, I think I've internalized at least from you that idea, not thinking so binary about trade-offs. Like there is so much room, you know, in the bottom 30% of whatever that conceivable trade-off is that you might be making.
But
And it's applicable to so many different things.
But what I like about economics is that you can have these very divergent ways of looking at something, and then you can cash it out at the end, which is to say, well, you know, we all came up with, like, there's no shortage of these fancy ideas about keep your workers happy and they'll work better for you. That's not really true. Lots of workers have been made happy by various things and they haven't worked better. So it's fantastic to have this discipline of, did you make better cars for less? That really holds your, what is it, you know, your belly to the
fire.
Anyway, that really keeps you honest. And there's lots of people bloviating around and saying we've got to be holistic, this. Well, you be as holistic as you like, cash it out in something that we can all say, hey, that's great. And that's what that was the sort of picture I was trying to paint with the HALE Index and teaching dyslexia, or I wish I'd asked in Shepparton, where people go, yep, this is the real thing. This is good.
We spoke about this on the phone, but you made the observation that a lot of Swedish businesses sort of have historically operated in this fashion, very bottom up.
Didn't know I'd made that point.
It was, yeah, and it was one of your, because I asked you the open question, like, how can it be that this tiny country just punch above their weight across industries? It's not just one industry they're very good at, but almost everything.
Yeah.
And I imagine for a HALE index, they would score exceptionally high, let alone the GDP per capita and all the rest.
Yeah.
But now you're telling me maybe you didn't say that. So
No. I think what I was saying is that they were very high skill, and that there are some things that I know only a tiny amount about Swedish management and so on, and it's been pretty keen to pioneer bottom-up methods. It hasn't been that successful at doing that. So, for instance, in the 1970s, Volvo, maybe Saab as well, were trying to do the kind of thing that Toyota brought off so brilliantly by saying, well, workers hate just working on one part of the line, so we'll turn them into artisans and they'll move down the line and they'll sort of multi-skill making a car. Great idea. It was one of the things I was thinking about when I said it's easy to make workers happier. And then the question is, can you bring it all through and actually show some productivity?
Are they happier but also just as productive?
And they couldn't.
Okay.
So, but at least they were trying, and they weren't trying too hard in America.
Yeah.
Although Americans have got their own reputation for innovation, which is pretty impressive in some ways and rather scary in others.
Yeah, well, there's some insane statistic. I feel like I'm throwing out a lot of fake news here, but something like within a 4 or 5 block radius near Menlo Park is more GDP than all of Australia.
Yeah.
This is one suburb in
Wealth would be,
at least
there would be a lot.
the companies with the headquarters in these locations.
Yeah.
Has there been a time in your life you've fallen into the trade-off mindset and then you've later regretted it big time?
Oh, no, not that I can think of. I don't want to argue there aren't trade-offs. Trade-offs are one of the ways we keep ourselves honest. It's just that they're not a metaphysical category. So, you know, I'm spending time with you. It means I can't spend time in another way. That's a trade-off. That's just the way it is. So trade-offs are everywhere.
That's the opportunity cost, or is that just a synonym for trade-off?
There are some ideas. Opportunity cost is to compare something with the next best thing you could do or be doing. So they're very similar ideas, and that idea is central to economics, and perhaps because of that, it gets taken to be some sort of metaphysical proposition. And in a way, I've just given you an example of the way in which it is. You just have to frame this thing properly and not just sort of galumph around and say, listen, children, health is always traded off against income.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to now lean into the McDonaldization of politics.
Let's do
because
that.
I think that follows up well from this, but I just got to change the batteries on this.
Okay.
What does it mean? The McDonaldization of politics.
I think I might have called it the fast foodization of politics, and I guess I thought of that as a very good metaphor for trying to talk about what I care about what's wrong with politics, and that is that if you're in politics, you have to cut through. A nice little factoid is that, and a lot of people blame the internet, and I'm happy for the internet and social media to bear some of the blame, but this is a pre-internet stat, which I think couldn't be more important. In America, between 1968 and 1988, in other words, before the internet had anything to do with our lives, the length of a presidential soundbite on TV network news went from, I think the figure is 48 seconds to 9 seconds. Now, democracy is kind of over if you are limited to 9 seconds.
If that's how you consume the complexity of the big ideas.
Exactly. So, and the other thing I wanted to appeal to about the idea of fast food is that fast food uses instincts and reflexes that we have that evolved on the African savannah to keep us safe and healthy. If you ate food that was fatty or sweet, that was a sign that it was good. And here we are in a very different circumstance in which fast food manufacturers make food for us. It's actually pretty good food, but it's laced with things to kind of quasi-addict us, sugar, fat, salt, things that make it finger-licking good. And it turns out that over time, that's now a poison. And that's kind of what's happened to our ability to think collectively, because we do it through this corroded system, this incredibly corroded discourse. Corrupting, it's a very bad thing.
It might be obvious, but say more about what you mean, the implications of our ability to think. Like, what does that mean in practice?
Well, if I want to say we're thinking about this in the wrong way, we should well, I don't know, we've just talked about trade-offs or something. There's no way I can get any of that across on the news or anything else. So then, and yet these things are incredibly important. How we think about something really matters. But if you do any media training, I mean, one of the things that happens with media training is that you go into media training and they sort of ask you a question about, they might say, well, your opponents say this. And you go, yeah, well, it's quite a good point, but I think this for these reasons, but they have a good point too. Well, the media trainer will say, no, that's the wrong way to do it. The media trainer will say, no, that's you're giving them way too much airtime. You're giving them respect. They're not doing that for you. So you just make it a nice, simple line, which is, this is all mistaken. This is all bad. These people are bad people. They're trying to rip you off. They're trying to lie to you. They're trying to mislead you. They're making money. Yeah, they're taking money on the side, whatever. You don't have to say all those things. You just hope that your audience thinks that. And virtually every communication in front of us is an attempt to manipulate us. So All marketing is an attempt to manipulate us. All politics is an attempt, and these are professional people who are there, who are paid, who have got full-time jobs to workshop things, to focus group things, and go, if we say that, then that'll really trigger this response in Rozelle and these other outer suburbs, and that's really what we want to do. So we have we've allowed this. So this is ultimately, in its maturity, this system is uninhabitable. Everyone knows this is going on. They've sensed it. They may not have done. They may not be able to quote Alistair McIntyre, the philosopher, like I can or whatever. They know that this is bullshit. This is bullshit. And they know that all of their politics is bullshit like this. And it doesn't matter who they vote for. So I'm getting at a discourse that there are also questions of what policies get pursued. And in fact, in some ways, the argument that our politics is busted because the politicians don't give us what we want, I think that is that's a dumbed down argument as well. What really...
5 seconds, though.
Exactly. What really gets us about our politics, I assert and cannot prove, is that it is uninhabitable, that it is a bunch of professionalized, optimized responses which doesn't feel authentic in any way. It feels like bullshit, and it is bullshit.
And it creates a desperate amount of cynicism.
Exactly. And yet, the trains still run on time. So the public tell themselves they're getting ripped off and so on, and there are lots of things wrong with what's happening. But actually, politicians are terrified of the population. That's kind of where we want them. But the population can only respond in this incredibly dumbed down way because that's the only purchase. That's the only agency they can show once every 3 years when they get to vote.
And then also what we're selecting for, because of these shorter sound bites and the constant spin and polling for what the right amount of words are, is actually just for the best rhetorician, the person who can speak best.
Exactly.
Totally separated from any other qualities or effectiveness they might have. Yeah. In your YouTube series, you talk about the better angels and how the two traits of the Machiavellian triad is now what we are selecting for with our politicians. Correct. So we set up, so the idea is that we have lots of competition. Competition's supposed to be a good thing. And in principle, it's a good thing because you just get these people to compete and you choose who you want. But in fact, they're competing, the media are all competing for our eyeballs. And the result of this is this incredibly inauthentic kind of gruel, this kind of non-substance that we are out. And that's driving people to despair. What has the response been to this idea that you floated? Whether it was
everyone kind of agrees with it, but doesn't want to do anything about it.
What can be done about it?
What can be done about it is that I have this kind of very simple way of my metaphysics of democracy, if you like. My simple idea is that there are two. Well, firstly, that I'm a believer in representative democracy. If we're going to have issues taken seriously and thought about at length, they can't be the result of a plebiscite because we don't have the time to cover everything. And so we need representatives. And the way we've got representatives in our system is through electoral competition. There is another way to have representatives, which we have used for 800 years since Magna Carta in our legal system, and that's called a jury. And I call that representation by sampling. So it's not representation by election, it's representation by sampling. And it is unmediated democracy in the sense that you can't go to uni and brown nose the right people to become a representative of the people in a jury. It's just a lottery. And as Aristotle said, democracy, the essence of democracy is, Aristotle regarded elections as an aristocratic mechanism because it separates the governed from those who are governed. It separates the governors from those who are governed, and it sets up a competition so that the those who are governed go, oh, I'll have that one. And we can talk about the pros and cons of that. Aristotle talked about democracy as taking turns in governing and being governed. And that's what was going on in Athens. So there's profundity in that. There's so much different about that way of representing the people that I think of it as a different institutional DNA. And I want to inject I want to basically complete the job that Magna Carta began. Magna Carta began by trying to inject this into our legal branch, and I want to inject it as a partner with the pyramid of power and patronage, which we all know and love, which we populate through people who've won elections. I want to entangle it like the legal system is entangled with institutions to represent ordinary people and their life world.
And this would eliminate campaigning?
No, it wouldn't eliminate it, but it would be another mechanism. So I would like to have a privately funded, the reason I want it privately funded is that the government won't fund it, but over time I want the government to fund it. And I want it to be a house like the House of Representatives or the Senate in Australia and in the United States, or the House of Commons and the House of Lords in the UK. This is another house, and it is populated by people who are chosen from a lottery, and they sit in this house and they vote the way they want to vote. And I think when Tony Abbott was getting rid of carbon pricing, there's quite good evidence that ordinary Australians, if they'd looked at that and spent their time and worked out that by now we'd have to find another $12 billion a year in revenue because we were getting all that revenue, they'd go, well, hang on, what's your plan for all that? Who's going to pay for that? And so they would have said, maybe 60% of them or more would say, no, we don't like the look of that. That would have made it harder for Tony Abbott to get it through the Senate. So it's simply introducing this other way to represent the people alongside the existing system. And another model of that is the Michigan Independent Citizens Redistricting Commission. In Michigan, the Republican Party, Michigan is a kind of majority Democrat state usually, and the Republican Party had managed to get sufficiently strong gerrymander that they every 10 years, I think it's every 10 years, they have to do a redrawing of the boundaries. People got hold of emails exchanged between officials and Republican Party apparatchiks saying, testing how much, whether these new boundaries would sustain a Republican government if the vote went against them by more than 60%. And they said, yep, we can live with those boundaries because that's what they will do. So that went all the way to the Supreme Court. In the Michigan Supreme Court, I think that's what it's called, they held that this was unlawful and that they would have to reject that redistricting and do it honestly. And it went to the Supreme Court and they said, nothing to see here. This is just states' rights, and isn't it wonderful? And then a young woman on a Facebook group said, I want to campaign for a citizen-initiated referendum for a body of ordinary people from Michigan to supervise the drawing of those boundaries. And that's what happened. And they've already done a redrawing of the boundaries. It's a fair redraw, broadly speaking, a fair redrawing. And I think that is a safer way to deliver fairness and a system that is resistant to corruption than any method of politicians appointing someone for reasons that I think are obvious. Yeah. So one is a little thought experiment by me, or a little say, this is what I want to do, and I want to privately fund it because I can't persuade governments to agree. And this other institution could be the beginning of a revolution. Australia's recently been through a process in which the duopoly, our Liberal/Conservative Party, and the Australian Labor Party voted as a bloc to come up with an electoral funding regime that keeps the money running to them and starves their competitors. Completely outrageous, completely self-serving. Those are the kinds of things, those are the kinds of rules that should be made by an independent body.
This third body would be able to assess for themselves.
Exactly. So what we need is we haven't properly established the public goods of the system. The public goods so public goods are things that governments provide and private goods are provided through the market. Private goods are things that are well provided by competition and something that everyone has to accept. You don't want competition for that. You have to get a social agreement to a single standard. So a public good is on
a public good, you don't want competition.
I mean, you may want competition for supplying it. So on a public good, a bridge, you might you will typically commission to get the lowest bid, but it will be the public sector that says the bridge goes here.
4 separate railway tracks all going to the same place with 4 different operators on it.
Exactly. So this is a piece I wrote a while back in which I distinguish between public goods of ideas and ideas that can live in competition with each other and other ideas that are like public goods. They're delivered by collective agreement. So one of those things is that our sense of not making up our own facts. That's not something which we collectively agree on. We're going to speak English. That's a public good. It's not provided competitively. So there are all these things that are provided in a unitary way, and and that's where they get undermined in politics, because we expect politicians who are all competing with each other to administer their own affairs. I mean, it's just basically obvious that they've all got a conflict of interest, and it's not that hard to invent it's not that hard to invent an institution where they don't have a conflict.
I thought, and you give this example in one of the YouTube videos, but the Brexit example is such a good encapsulation of all of this, because it was this pretty hectic rhetoric that swept the country up to a frenzy. Are we sending out pounds abroad? We can take care of ourselves. These bloody European bureaucrats are just ruining my country. Let's get rid of them. We're the great kingdom. We can take care of ourselves. But to the point, if they had this third independent body that actually came and assessed it,
spend the time.
It would become, hopefully you would think at least, abundantly clear that, all right, this is just rhetoric we're getting swept away by, not in fact an economic reason.
Well, look, I happen to
be self-inflicted wounds in modern history.
Yes, exactly. And I would say the same with the great self-inflicted wound in Australia is the abolition of carbon pricing. Exactly the same story. I happen to think that Brexit was nuts, but I don't really want to argue that, well, it's sort of important to me that the considered opinion as there was
they saw it and still went with Brexit.
Yeah, exactly. And that's fine. But what I want to say to you is, do you want to go with the opinion of the people or the considered opinion of the people? Yeah. I want to go with the considered opinion. Yeah, so and if the considered opinion is we should abolish carbon pricing or go ahead with Brexit, then we should, because I disagree, but this is democracy.
And you're suggesting it is like jury duty. It is a lottery. You're picked out of a hat and you are obliged to participate.
Look, if I'm the dictator, yes, you're obliged to participate. What did the Romans ever do for us? But I'm not. So I'm just trying to say, let's do this. Just like it's a bottom-up story. Let's not ask for permission. Let's get some money together. It's not a vast amount of money. There's lots of philanthropic money around. All we need is an understanding of why this is an important thing and why this could be a really useful institution to build. And if we can do that, then we can, at some point, like when a government needs the crossbench to form a government or whatever, you actually tip the institution into the Constitution, because the crossbench might well say, as I think the Teals would say, if the crossbench in Australia would say, if this institution was up and running, it would say, well, if you want us to help you form a government, we'd like to have this third chamber ticking away.
And the fundraising is happening through lateral economics? Or
well, I'm not. No, I mean, none of this is going but all I need is some people with more money than me to put down, the first 100 grand or whatever. I've certainly been talking to various NGOs who have enough money to do this. I haven't been able to persuade them to do it, but this is what I'm trying to do. Is I'm trying to create what I call an activism of sortition. And what I mean by that is I don't want to go and ask for permission. I don't want to go and see politicians and have them pat me on the head and send a few bureaucrats out and say how great it is and all the rest of it. I want to try and do it as much as can be done. I want to try and do it and do as much as can be done without government buy-in, and then present it to government at a time when they've got sweaty palms, when they're thinking, geez, okay, look, if you really want that thing, it's a bit uncomfortable for us, but geez, it's not a deal breaker. It's not that hard.
It doesn't sound radical.
No, it
to my
isn't.
ears,
no.
But it does sound extremely ambitious.
Well, it's just a different way to think, and that's the hardest thing. It's not. So if I said we need to double indirect tax in Australia, I would have no confidence that you could ever negotiate that with a government that has just got into, with a party, with a party that's just got into power with a promise not to do that. That's really hard. There's a sort of red political line. Yeah. There's no red line here. It's just, and it's not even the case that these pollies look at it and go, oh, that's a bit of a loss of power for me. I mean, they're grown-up people. Their whole life is about finessing 1,000 constraints on their time, on their power. So they're used to this stuff. But because not enough powerful people are saying in sufficient unison, do this, they just do other things. But you can do difficult and unpopular things. If you get an elite consensus that it needs to be done, politicians go through hell for you. Look at John Howard and the indirect tax.
Define an elite consensus. Who are the...
Well, I mean, my example comes from economics because my father was part of of the bringing of the discipline of economics to Australian policy making through the 60s. Australia had high tariffs, and my father was one of the people who said, this doesn't make any sense. It's making us poorer. It looks like it's making us richer. If you want to go out into the electorate and say it's protecting your jobs, you can, but you're kidding yourself, you're kidding the community, and we know it's bullshit. Now, in 1968, Max Corden wrote an article, and it began, Australia's tariffs are largely an academic question. Politicians will never support lowering tariffs. 7 years later...
Protectionist reasons.
Yeah. Well, it's just part of the Australian psyche. 7 years later, there was a 25% tariff cut, which my father was involved in, as he said, whispering into the ear of the prince. What was happening was that inflation was rising. There was overfull unemployment. There was overfull employment. And this made a huge amount of sense. And he was able to kind of graft away and get it through the bureaucracy. And so that's 1973. Sorry, I said that's only 5 years later. That's 1973. And then in 1988, it was all over. 1988, there was a big industry statement and they reduced all tariffs down to 5%. Now, that is the power of elite consensus. If you went to ask someone, they'd say, this is nuts.
So with your idea for the third governing body, who do you identify as the elite consensus that you need to
There are lots of people
sort out,
bloviating away about how trust is going down in our society. We need to consult more, all that kind of stuff. And so there are lots of people doing this, and there are lots of people who think it would be good to have a special purpose advisory citizen assembly, say on house prices or tax or something. And I think that would be better than nothing, but not much better than nothing, because it doesn't build an institution. And it also involves it also involves setting yourself up as a sort of policy entrepreneur with 100 randomly selected Australians connected to you, going as supplicant to the government, going to government and saying, this is our idea, you're the government, can you please do this? And then it becomes an issues management issue for the government, and they go, oh, yeah, that's all right. Well, we'll do this, this, and this, and we won't do that. Yeah. And everyone moves on. Bullshit, in other words. I mean, they will probably have some quite good. It's not that citizen juries always come up with all the right answers, but what I'm trying to do is to build some kind of check and balance, some kind of way in which these two things become entangled. These two things are answerable to each other. Most people aren't talking like that. Most people really are just trying to have trial things and temporary things, and it just sounds easier to get someone to agree to.
And the media buy-in, how important is that for this elite consensus?
Yeah, I don't think, you see, I was involved, let me tell you a story. I was involved with Rory Stewart when Rory Stewart was running for Mayor of London, and he's a big fan of these ideas, and part of his platform was to govern with a randomly selected council of citizens. And I organised a group of stars to talk to Rory. I won't say I was a star, but a guy called Joe Trippi, who took Howard Dean from back market to front runner in the 2004 presidential election, who put together the team, the eyes of which were picked out of, I haven't put that correctly, and went into Obama's campaign. He worked out how to use the internet for campaigning back in the days when we weren't trying to use it to wreck the world. And so there was him, and there was a guy called Dane Waters, who was a fairly senior person in the John McCain campaign. And so we all had this meeting by teleconference, and Rory's staff just didn't like much of this stuff. And I thought, well, I know what this is. This is gatekeeping. You know, they're pissed off that I've managed to knock on the door and be invited into the living room, you know. I was completely wrong. They said, well, we focus group this, and when you tell people that he's going to do this, people say to us, we don't need another committee. We need a strong leader. So you have to show people what this is. That's the hardest bit of work. If people knew this, if people had seen the citizen juries that I've seen, they would be all for this. But you can run this for another 2 decades and they won't, there'll be a citizen jury run. Most people won't really be aware of it. They will have heard that there was this citizens group and they suggested a new package on housing, you know. So something needs to be done so that people get the feeling that this counts for something, so that the government is sweating on what these citizens will say because they're trying to get something through the Senate. And the people in the Senate say, well, I'd like to know what they think, which some of them will. So it's a way to fold, it's a way to build an institution from outside and just have it there, and it can have its own impact because we're still in an open society. No one gets arrested for doing any of this stuff yet, and it can have quite a big impact. And as people participate in this, I mean, it's just incredible. If you run these things properly, 95% of people report it as a good experience. Half of those report it as a very good experience. Half of those report it as an amazingly, exceptionally good experience. And then as you get to the tail, and we're still talking about, say, 15% of these people, it's life-changing. You know, they go and stand for local council at the next opportunity. Right. They walk out thinking, why aren't we doing things this way? So that's the thing.
Is it because it's new and you can say radical, revolutionary, whatever, but just anything that's new is naturally always going to be rejected immediately?
Like, it's also old.
Change. No, but rather it's a new idea to
no, but it's also an old idea.
All right. So, but so because it's Lindy that suggests that it could be worthwhile, but like, I just mean in the psyche of the individuals to the point that you were just.
Yeah, of course. course.
Because it's new, it's going to be met with rejection. It's going to be met with skepticism. It's going to be with like, why change things?
Yeah.
You know, this is just going to be a big effort for nothing. I don't like change, whatever.
Yeah.
Like that might be the steepest part of the climb, would you say? Right. And then in your eyes, are you thinking this could be a decade, a 2-decade, a lifetime project?
Well, all these things are lifetime projects, but, you know, you can't know. Well, it was likely 3 months ago, it was likely that there would be a hung parliament and that the crossbench would have a lot of power. And I was very down and dirty with the crossbench, and I'd spoken to a whole bunch of those crossbenchers. I raised quite a bit of money for one of them. It wasn't any kind of quid pro quo. I knew that she was quite sympathetic to this, but at the same time wasn't becoming, you know, someone who would take any instruction from me. And even before it became clear that the government would have an increased majority, I went from being somewhat optimistic that the crossbench might insist upon that to realising that I hadn't really even got them over the line, because if you're a politician, you're very sensitive to social proof. So you kind of go and ask other people and they go, oh, that's an interesting idea. But nobody seems to be saying it. So I realised that it was, even if we got a hung parliament, that they wouldn't. It's very unlikely that they would have the solidarity and the presence of mind to say this is very high on our list of what we want, and we know we can put it high on our list because there's nothing about this. Even though you might, you know, when we go into your office and say to Albo or Peter Dutton, we want this, and he'd go, gee, that's pretty weird. That's all they're going to say. They're not going to say, well, I can't possibly live with that. So it was obvious to me by the time we got to the election that even if there was a hung parliament, it wouldn't be strong enough at that point. But I work away on all kinds of people who have money and are quite senior, and you just keep working away, just like my father did on tariffs. The difference is that tariffs had a fairly monolithic profession behind them, and it was kind of obvious that they were dumb. This is a similarly clean and crisp idea, but it's a constructive idea, not a destructive idea. It doesn't just say take this away and everything will be better. So it's harder. But what's life about? It's just about, if you think you've seen something that's simple and powerful, I enjoy.
And the difficulty's worth it.
Yeah, and the more I think about it, the more I see. So it's not just that I'm running a campaign for this, which I am, but as the way you introduced this by talking about fast food, and I've moved a long way since I've got to a much deeper level of understanding all these things than then. I didn't have any problem explaining my views in relation to fast food. But I was talking about fast food before I'd got to the stage of saying things like there are two ways to represent the people. In the legal system, we entangle those two ways with the pyramid of power and patronage and the life world of the people represented by a jury, and we need to do something similar for the legislative and executive branch. It's kind of beautifully simple, isn't it?
It really is.
And it's beautifully it's low risk.
Totally.
What can happen? But there you are. I would say that it makes such great sense.
Yeah. When did you first conceptualize this? Was there a light bulb moment?
No. I can tell you exactly when I started thinking about this. And this was at the time when there was a confluence of two things. The Republican, so John Howard's just got elected in 1996. He's promised to neutralise the issue of the Republic. He's promised to have a referendum on the Republic. And Pauline Hanson, who, if you're not Australian, is a sort of early, just to dumb it down a bit, a kind of early right-wing populist.
Her political party's called One Nation.
Her political party's One Nation, and she's surfacing the kinds of things that have become more salient over time, if you like, anti-woke before woke was even a word. And I was extremely unhappy about this because the political system was organising a debate between Republicans and monarchists, and my attitude is we already live in a republic. It's just got a Monty Python show up the top, and there are only a few, the royal family they're called, and there are occasional very unusual circumstances in which they actually have some input into the choice between, but this was then turned into a big symbolic thing about real change by electing the president, or more of the same, which was appointing the president. And none of this made any sense, because the only reason people wanted to, the reasoning behind elect the president went like this. We don't want just another politician being the president. We want our own person, so we'll vote for them. Who do you think that might get you? You think you might get a politician if you vote for them? Right. All the other votes you've had, you get politicians who win those votes. So it was just complete magical thinking. The idea that if you elect the president, it will somehow improve your democracy. No one had said...
You're still selecting for the types of individuals that
you're running a campaign. People will campaign, and one of them, somebody will win. Yeah. So it was just a sort of piece of... It was a little bit like the process that led to Trump in some ways. I just had a conversation with someone today where he said, things are so broke, it's good to smash things up and see what arises in their place. Well, no, it's not. Worse things arise in their place. Yeah. So this was just sort of magical thinking brought about by the idea, hey, let's have an Australian head of state. It wasn't thinking what's wrong with our democracy, what can be done better. And on the other hand, you've got someone who's showing you that there's a real dissatisfaction with a bunch of things. Now, I'm not a particular fan of Pauline Hanson. I always believe in trying to, just to understand someone, you kind of paint what they're saying in a good light. Think, if I imagined this person wasn't just a dark, horrible person, what are they trying to tell me? Mm. And what she's trying to tell me is that she feels, and all the people who vote for her, feel pretty pissed off about the fact that they've had no damn education, they're ignored, they're belittled, they're told that if they were Indigenous, they'd get a grant, but if they're white, they won't get a grant. I don't want to particularly buy into that. What I want to say is that the democracy should take that seriously, not hold the cross up like she's some vampire. And again, it's not really about her. It's about a large number of people who are responding to this message and saying we are not being heard. Yeah. And in that context, I just sort of, just as a thought experiment, I think I did write something, but it wasn't me campaigning for it particularly. But in that context, I started thinking, well, you could, something which would be a change and would address some of the things that I think are wrong with our democracy. It would actually be change the system, but not in a foolhardy and radical way, to say to Pauline Hanson, well, you've got concerns. Why don't we'll put this body together and it'll be just ordinary Australians. And we will, for the first time in our history, we will know what the considered opinion of Australians is. We've got 100,000 opinion polls sticking microphones into people's face when they walk out of the supermarket. But this will be an opportunity to discover the considered opinion of the people. Isn't that going to be a good thing? So that was where I first started thinking
away from the visceral reactions that you might feel to the 9-second sound.
Exactly.
And then someone who maybe does adore Pauline Hanson and a lot of her policies, when met with a bunch of other people who are also taking the time to talk about and consider as well, they might not lose those ideas, but they might soften them a bit.
Or they might go the other way. And the people who are saying that certain things are politically incorrect, they might go and visit her in Ipswich and find that there's a lot of white dysfunction. A lot of people wandering around in offices without shoes on, for instance. And they might get a bit of a wake-up call and they might, good things might happen. And I, in many ways, feel sort of stronger solidarity with that than elite. Us elites, we've got lots of education, lots of resources. Elites don't need any help from me. We've always, the idea of social democracy, the idea of progressivism is based on a kind of something that sort of is the sort of one essence of Christianity, which is that we make our moral bearings against the sentiments of people who aren't doing very well. Well, let's take that seriously. That's what I want to do. But I don't want to do it in an ideological way. I don't want to sentimentalize them. I don't want to say they're good and we're bad. All that's reductive and silly. I want to get it's a bit like the people in Port Jackson in Sydney in 1788. I want to get these two worlds together and say, what do you make of each other? Because you'll like each other in the end. You will, trust me, you will like each other.
That's right.
And you will learn that you can disagree with someone and still love them as a brother.
Yeah.
Because that's what I can show you on some filmed citizen juries where people continue to disagree and actually got very angry with each other, and then they thought, yeah, that's what democracy is supposed to be about, isn't it?
Do you think in your lifetime that something which used to be taken for granted, at least I feel like it used to be taken for granted, I'm not sure, but you could really disagree with people on pretty fundamental parts of their worldview, but still be like best mates, or at least be mates? And I don't know if this is just my own anecdotal experience, but it feels like the cost of disagreeing with someone has really grown over time.
That's right.
And whether that's because of the sort of medium being the internet or the various social medias, and that's a way to filter who actually ends up getting into your life. But I don't know if this is just, hogwash anecdotal experience,
no, I think
or
it's
whether
true.
there is some truth to it. And that's also kind of sad because...
So my model of this is rather inarticulate, but think of life world, what we learn in our families and in neighborhoods and so on, and then think of the set of rules and procedures that an institution has. And then imagine that when I was first in the workforce, there was 30% rules and procedures and 70% the life world. And now imagine it's reversed or it's worse than that. And everyone who goes into an office spends endless time acknowledging the traditional owners, going through all kinds of what I call new pieties, and they censor their own speech, and there are all kinds of things they can't say. What's happened is that the institutional world has taken over the life world.
Okay.
And politics, the way we do, so at a deeper level, the difference between representation by election and representation by lottery is that representation by election is representation by words. It is people will use words and symbols and rhetoric and TikToks and charisma to do whatever it takes to get your vote. And then they've got to govern for 3 years, then they've got to get your vote again. And the life world is not feeling good about it. It doesn't feel that it lives in that process. It feels like that this process has occasional need to manipulate it. That's it. And so I find that manipulative, inauthentic, just part of the uninhabitability of our culture.
It's very sort of devastating and grim, like that sort of realization, or at least that observation.
And that we are right next to something that could work so much better. So it's not that we are in a Great Depression, or it's not that there's anything so terribly wrong. It is, well, I think it is sort of terribly wrong, but it's wrong in a very subtle sort of way. It's wrong in a way that keeps making us like scratching an itch. We keep wanting to vote in a way that will fix this, but by definition, it can't fix this because it has to run the gauntlet of legibility. It has to, and be legible, you have to work with comms people to dumb it down and to get your message across. So this is the eclipse of the life world in our political life. You can't really even do, so if you've got a domestic and then everyone knows in my cadre, in my group of people, that it's a sort of factoid, and I believe it's fairly well supported, that the Indigenous women have substantially more domestic violence committed against them than non-Indigenous women. So we're all invited to think of that as a scandal, which I'm happy to think of it as a scandal. Nobody mentioned that Indigenous men beat them up. Now, some white people beat them up as well. But you can't talk about that. And yet that is at the heart of the problem. This is not me blaming anyone. I'm not interested in blame. I'm interested in trying to deal with it. You are not allowed to talk about it, so you won't be able to deal with it, will you? But we will spend more and more money, and some of these programs will be good and some of them won't be, but they will not be predicated on looking at the problems and thinking, what do we do?
Yeah, that anecdote, or not an anecdote, but you mentioning how the majority of domestic violence against Aboriginal women is committed by Aboriginal men.
Yep.
Reminds me of an interview I did with a fellow called Mike Salbro. He works in the Cherbourg community in Brisbane. He actually was born in Australia, raised in Sweden, funnily enough. Anyway, he's Aboriginal and he's actually one of the last of the stolen generation. But anyway, it was amazing talking to him because he's at this cross section where he's part of the Aboriginal community in Cherbourg, which is on all the social and economic indicators, one of the lowest performing parts of the country. And he's the sort of medium between the Aboriginal community and then the police force. And just the constant social tension and social costs he's dealing with every day. But like, no, you just beat up your wife and you haven't addressed your kids for who knows how long. You're going. Yeah. And then he's like the bad guy because he brought the police into the community. But it's like a guy like this, man, what a fucking hero.
So there's a guy, and I don't know whether I can remember his name, and maybe you can. I don't know whether you're an AFL fan, but there was a guy, I think he was a coach of Indigenous players. I think he was in Adelaide and then he was at Collingwood and various places. And he went on a TV program and he said something which was kind of designed to be provocative, and it might also be something that he believed. And he said he wouldn't take an Aboriginal recruit who had two Aboriginal parents. He said he would take one with one Aboriginal parent because spicy indeed, and he was basically run out of town. Now that guy helped 100 Aboriginal players, had given his life to coaching Aboriginal players. Now, I'm not telling you that what he said was either offensive or not offensive.
Probably poorly said.
Well, whatever. That's not his job. His job is to deal with Indigenous players, not manage the media's sensitivities.
Exactly.
On that question.
Because of how uncomfortable
it makes us.
If people had to start saying, "Wow, why did he say that?"
Why don't, before we produce this guy, before we slander this guy, why don't we go and talk to the 100 Indigenous players that he's helped and ask them? This is sort of the case everywhere.
Yeah.
And this is putting legibility ahead of the life world. That's the key idea.
Yeah.
And the jury is about carrying the life world into the pyramid of power.
I really like the way that's all framed, and I'm happy that it was framed that way as well, because the whole point of me introducing that Australian scorecard, which we won't finish, but was to make the point that, look, we're doing pretty bloody good, all external metrics, especially compared to the rest of the world.
Yeah.
But yet, nonetheless, here is a bunch of ideas for how it could be even better.
Sure.
Because something I sense in your work as well is that, things are great, but why not try and make them as good as they can possibly. Ceiling can keep.
Can we be grateful for the fact that if this was 200 years ago, we wouldn't be sitting here with a cup of tea here and all this stuff. We wouldn't be out having a cappuccino when we felt like it, or dare I say smashed avocado. We would be living at subsistence. We've got a massive amount to be grateful for. I love Western culture. That's nothing against Asian culture. I don't know about Asian culture. I think the Parthenon is the greatest building I've ever had anything to do with. How the cathedrals were built is beyond me. We live in this world of unbelievable achievement. And can we be grateful for that? And then we can also say there's a lot of shit going on.
Right.
And we have the tools to not to solve all these problems, and certainly not to solve them by edict from the top, but we have the tools to work on these problems. Why don't we? And it's not about talking. That's another thing. It's not about being legible. It's not about going on Q&A and listening to the panel. It's about the people in the audience.
Yeah.
We're supposed to be a democracy.
The best questions come from the audience.
Yeah.
But then I haven't watched so much Q&A, but at least from some of the YouTube clips that I have come across, it's always kind of underwhelming in the responses.
It's awful.
You know,
It's
like,
awful. It's everything.
That was an interesting question. There could have been something more there.
Yeah. Well, I remember I was chairing a thing called the Government 2.0 Task Force in time, and Mark Scott, who was then the CEO of the ABC, said they had this, and the buzzword of the time was social media, and he was telling me of this amazing new program they were proving up, and what was amazing about it was that people could tweet. Anyway, so it was quite a fresh program to start off with, but pretty quickly, journalists' instinct to frame everything as a conflict between left and right took over, and
so boring.
And so I've even developed I think in the industry it's called a treatment, which is an idea for a show, which is, and here's this idea that if our democracy is built around the DNA of representation by election, it means that the entire structure of institutions around our democracy reflects that DNA, and Q&A reflects that DNA, because what does Q&A do? It separates the governed, who are in the audience, from those who govern. And so what would it be like to develop a TV program that came from the world of representation by lottery? Not hard to imagine. Take Q&A, throw away the panel, make the audience representative, stick them in the Big Brother house. Don't have to do that, but you get them to deliberate on subject, and then you make a documentary about who thought what, who changed their mind, why did they change their mind, who persuaded, so on. Was it a feelings thing? Was it a reason thing? Who did they know that meant that they thought, oh, I get it. I see why you're saying that. We could do that.
Yeah.
But you have to invest. And the ABC's got enough money to run a program like that. The BBC's certainly got enough money to run a program like that.
No.
But everyone's optimizing around their little horizon, not looking for a bigger story.
You still in touch with Rory Stewart, edging him with this idea? Because he's now one of the most powerful media voices.
He is.
And, you know, my admiration for the man. But
yes, no. But he and I have talked about me being on his show, and he fears that the people running the show won't be impressed enough with my profile, and so someone else will get on the show.
That's terrible.
So, well, that's the way our system works, and Rory would like to have me on the show. But
like that's the whole point of having, like, in my opinion at least, with this new media,
exactly,
you can have a podcast which costs nothing, but get the types of eyeballs that entire news station.
But his operation is a big commercial operation, and good on him. It's terrific.
The rest, goal hanger, you know. The production company for all those various podcasts.
Yeah.
But like, I think at least, and there are guys out there who do this really well, like Joe Rogan. Now he's a reflection of his own interests. So he's rising comedians or he's rising archery guys and so forth. But if Joe was super interested in radical politics, you know, he wouldn't think.
Well, I don't call this radical politics. But it's authentic politics or whatever.
Different, you know, different. Anything that's not the standards can be classified as that. But I think like one of the marvelous things about this new media is that for a show creator, they have the opportunity to curate the entire show at the scale that these other organizations had to before without the vested interests. Yeah. Because there's no investing here.
No, well, you're talking about, well, now Joe Rogan has got big vested interests. I mean, that's worth hundreds of millions of dollars. So
yeah, but I know I don't know the man, obviously.
Yeah.
I actually think there's a big narrative about him which isn't necessarily true.
But I'm not criticizing him.
No, like, what are his vested interests? He reads ads.
But
like
he wants his. Look, if you. Yeah, I know. But if you have me on your show and not RFK Jr. or someone's heard of, it's a little bit of a dip in your ratings.
The point is that you can survive that long.
Of course, he can survive it.
So many different interviews.
That's right.
Episodes
that's right.
Like the cost of bringing on someone with a lower
no,
is much less than it may.
No, but there are. You know, I mean, I must have got 2 or 3 emails this week with people who want to come on my podcast.
Nice.
And my podcast is not, there's a few thousand people who consume it. So just think of what's heading in Joe Rogan's direction. A fire hydrant of stuff. So how am I going to get...
I'm not suggesting that you would try and get on there.
No,
but for someone who's in that position, if they have those interests, that they would not suffer the cost to elevate voices.
I agree. And I'm not making a comment against either Joe or Rory, who I think of as a friend and who's been, generous to me. There are realities about the world. There are layers of considerations. And, if Rory said we have to have him on, I don't think that would be too much of a problem. He would like to have me on, I think, and other people wouldn't, and that's reasonable too. And they'd probably say the same sort of thing to Rory, saying, I want this sort of person on, and Rory might say no. So that's all entirely legitimate. All I'm saying is that, it is a general problem, I think, we have culturally, that it's so much more lucrative, it's so much better for clicks to have people who have profile. And you can see a problem there. There is a chicken and egg problem there.
Yeah, look, I say that 100%. If you look at the top 10 ratings for all the interview shows across any country, like it's kind of, especially in the English-speaking world, there's a huge overlap of guests.
Yes,
around
exactly.
the same time.
Yeah, and we've all heard of the guests. And so if I'm going through Rory's program, The Leading, I'm likely to click on the person I recognise. That's just a fact.
The time risk for something that might be, but I don't know even if that is like a problem. That once you get a big show, you sort of start to gamify the metrics and think about, okay, if I get on this guest and I ask them this series of questions, it's going to pop. I'm going to have 20 nice shorts for me to spread throughout the internet.
Yeah.
Like I could have just come on here and said to you, all right, Peter Dutton, why didn't he win? We can
I can bloviate away.
And we'll get a response, and it'll be like, right. We clip this up, and then I know the video is why Peter Dutton lost.
That's right.
All of a sudden, it's going to get a bunch of clips.
Yeah.
But it's not interesting to me. I doubt it's interesting to you.
It's not.
And then those examples are just, run infinite. Think about is that with this sort of new media, with those so low barriers to entry, and the fact that you can now enter a playground that has conceivably billions of English-speaking people around the world who can consume this thing, that there is a chance that you find that niche who is as well feeling the same as you and me. They want this type of stuff.
I think that's true.
I think that's true. I don't know if I have a point behind any of that at all, but it does give me a great sense of optimism in the face of maybe the, some of the negative things we've identified about the culture.
Yeah, I agree. And there's not much point. I had something in my newsletter where I commented on this really quite sad piece by a millennial who thought she'd come up with a really great line about how rough the millennials' lives are. And she said, we're not after handouts, we're after hope. And I thought, well, I don't know who gives you hope. That's hard. But I said, I don't have any hope particularly. I do have faith. And by faith, I mean that you plug away, you think what you're doing is worthwhile. If that's the case, then in a sense it is worthwhile and you will succeed to some extent, or maybe you will not succeed at all. But I have faith that even if I don't succeed at all, that I know already, and I've spoken to this as we've been speaking, there are already valuable things for me in having done all this stuff, because I've thought about stuff in a way that goes deeper and in a way that is active. It's not just, I might be able to get an article published in some academic journal. It is that I'm engaging with the world in a full-throated way as a human being who has feelings and is offering a way of thinking that he thinks is valuable and he thinks should be in the marketplace. That's worth doing. And will it lead to something? Let's hope it does. It's not like going out there and making money where you can just say that you failed and then it wasn't worth it.
Right.
In this game, it's part of life to think about stuff, discuss stuff, and so on.
It might be a little bit sappy. Tell me if it is or not. But there's an idea.
Let's do some sap.
There's an idea that I really like by Carl Jung. This idea of individuation, like
Right.
what it is
Yeah.
to fully
Yeah.
become yourself.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because it ties into a lot of the other ideas that he is a super original thinker put together.
And who's this person?
Carl Jung, Carl Gustav.
Oh, Carl Jung.
Yeah.
Yeah. He's original, right?
Yeah. But the sort of the top of his whole worldview is that we're all trying to individuate, to become our full selves, realize our full potential. But it's nice because the whole point of it is that you will never ever reach it.
Sure.
Like it's always just the peak is just over the clouds and
things open up. Things open up as you go.
And therefore, like to individuate is actually impossible, but the journey along it,
Sure,
as close as you
Sure.
can get to it,
Sure.
like that's kind of a life well lived.
Yes.
And the journey, the things you're doing along the way is up to our own agency and our own interests and how we feel about responsibility and what family duties we want to take on and so forth. It like leaves all those questions in our own hands to deal with. It's not told by some moral system, one of the monotheistic ones, actually how you should live your life. Rather just make sure that it's a journey to anyway.
Well, I would say that there's also an ideas version of that, and that is if you have clarified your ideas, if you've pondered things deeply and you've come to some new way to look at things, then vistas open up. So I start thinking of these two ways to represent the people, and that leads me to have an idea about how to design a TV program. So it goes on, and things you get to re-see the world. You get to see the world in new forms, which you discover something that you didn't know before.
Yeah.
So I think that's good. Learning stuff is very pleasurable.
Amen. So I've tried to be as exhaustive as possible for your worldview, but naturally we've probably only scratched the surface. But
that's what worldviews are like.
At least on like the big core things you're thinking about right now. Would you agree it's been addressed?
Yes,
because then we've gone very long, and there's a couple more questions I'd love to ask you. So we'll see how quickly we can maybe get through them.
Okay.
But you're okay?
Yeah.
All right. Fantastic.
Sure.
Well, pokies. So, I knew just anecdotally how bad they were, but I only just moved back to this country, having been away for almost a decade, and so was really struck in the face by it. Like this is so grim. Like it's a negative public good. It has no right to be in public spaces. And some of the statistics were crazy. Australia has roughly 18% of the world's poker machines, despite having 0.3% of the world's population. And Australia is the world's biggest gambling losers per capita.
That's right. By a big margin.
Wagering and losing around $25 billion each year. So it's washing cash.
That makes it $1,000 a person.
Which is nuts.
Yeah.
And I don't know what the stats are, but let's assume it's like less than 20% are actually using them. Yeah. Anyway, so.
That's right, which makes it $5,000 per person who uses it.
I see where they're fun, they hit every dopamine sensor, they're habitual, so forth. But I wonder, I was trying to think, what's actually a relevant question, but do you think if they were primarily used by elites, they would have already been banned?
They're instruments of extraction. I'll tell you a story. When I was in Singapore about 12 years ago, something like that, I had an afternoon to kill, and I was wandering around Singapore. Well, I was actually underneath that silly boat, with the three towers that are
the garden towers.
Yeah, well, there are three towers, and there's a massive long boat stuck over the. Anyway, at the bottom of one of those towers. At the bottom of one of those towers was a casino. And I thought, okay, I'll go into the casino and just sort of look around. I wasn't really, I find betting in such places pretty boring. But, it's just an interesting thing to look around, see what's happening. And so I went to go in, and they said, "Excuse me, sir, you can't go in." And they said, "Do you have your passport on you?" And I said, "No, I don't." And then they said, all right, well, if you don't have your passport on you proving that you're a foreigner, you have to pay us 100 Singapore dollars, which is 100 American dollars roughly. And I thought, well, there you go. They're happy to be predators against foreigners. They don't want to be predators against their own population. That I like that.
Yeah, right.
You have to prove that you're a foreigner, and then they'll say, if you're stupid enough to come in and have your money taken off you, be my guest.
In some sense, we kind of do that as well. You go to Crown down the road or Star in Sydney.
Yeah.
It's like just eye test 80% foreign tourists.
Fine, and that's fine.
Right.
That's fine. I don't have a problem with that. They can look after themselves. Yeah. But there's lots of these profit maximizing outfits are going to try and get money from wherever they can, and they destroy lives. So it's there's I don't know whether you know of a guy called Matthew Crawford, who is he's sort of recently taken to Substack. He wrote a terrific book called The World Beyond Your Head, and it's about addiction, our addiction to social media, but he goes into detail about gambling and some of these other things. It's just horrific. Anyway, what it is it's predation. It's consensual predation. That's true, and that's better than non-consensual predation. But it's predation, and again, most Australians object to it. Most Australians want quite a lot stronger regulation of it, but the gambling interests have managed to buy off the politicians. But if you had a citizen assembly on this, it would confirm, and you might get a swing. So you start with the raw score of how many Australians are against it. I don't know the answer to that, but it's more than a majority. And then over time, as people learn about it, you may well get a larger swing.
It would be a great battleground for the Third Assembly.
Yes, indeed. And I think the Teals want it. All the independents I know want it. I'm not sure. I don't know what Bob Catter thinks, but Andrew Wilkie, all kinds of independents want it. And so far, the money and power has managed to keep it as a playground for money to frolic and to enrich itself off the foibles of problem gamblers. There are also people for whom inexplicably it's a form of entertainment, and that's fine. But there's plenty of problem gambling amongst it. And
that's also a leading indicator of a lot of other sort of things.
That's right.
I think, and this may be Rory Sutherland's idea, but I love his idea about pubs. Is it his idea? Who knows? An idea that pubs should be tax-free because they're...
Oh, that's Rory Sutherland.
Is that Rory Sutherland? Okay.
Yeah.
Because they are, in fact, a sort of public good.
Yeah.
You and I go into a pub right now, even though we might not interact with anyone, increases the vibe for everyone else in the pub. More people there, more chatter, more feeling of connection and humanity and so forth. And then take it one step further, like pokies have no business at your local pub where you jump in for lunch and drop 100 into the pokies, buy a steak and chips and have a beer and then leave. It would create so many more conceivable uses in a competitive market for this space. Like pubs don't have to just be a place where you go to watch the dogs, go to bet ponies, or go to eat a steak and chips. You can open up the trivia nights, open up family nights, get really creative with it. Like why couldn't a pub have Thursday night movie? Like things like that. And if you remove the pokies from it, it immediately changes the environment and the type of people that are going to be there. And then if it's tax-free, way more people are going to be going because the competition of the pubs is like their costs are going to go down straight away. They'll be able to have more staff there. They'll be able to be more creative with the activities that they're going to create and so forth. Anyway.
Well, I mean, if I wanted to forego revenue or spend money, I've already told you that I'd want to target that, so I would do something like fund with the program I Wish I'd Asked and these social connection programs, and maybe some of them could be run from pubs, but it's a good thought starter to say that, but I think you kind of want the capacity for a community to develop ideas about what it wants and to govern that and steer that. And it's easy to say forgive us some tax. It's anyone who says forgive us some tax, they should also be asked to tell us who they want to tax more, because that's it's harder to answer that question.
Okay. So you want
you want to keep
equation
them
to
honest,
match.
don't you? I mean, I can think of lots of ways that it'd be nice to
Right.
have. I mean, I got the Victorian government had too much money at one stage, and I got a letter from the Victorian government saying that because I hadn't had a speeding ticket in 3 years, they were going to send me $50. Well, it was just completely absurd.
That's
It's not influence.
incentivize
It's got
you to
nothing.
not
It's just
speed on the
totally
roads.
nuts.
Yeah,
Okay,
that is
but I mean, it felt good. It was, so I could run
It's
around.
still so
So
ridiculous.
someone had come up with that idea,
yeah.
and someone would say, "Would it be good?" Well, we should reward people for having a good record.
It's kind of dehumanizing too. It's like, that's not the reason you decided to.
Well, that's possible too. That's possible too. But anyway, what I'm saying is that we need to try to develop capacities for communities to enrich themselves, and by enrich I don't mean economically particularly, although that will happen too. But this is one of the things that's not functioning very well, particularly in disadvantaged communities, and you can find ways in which people gain confidence in each other and end up having a great time and being constructive. And at the moment, these communities are so full of rent extraction that they're demoralised. I mean, there's nothing more demoralising than going to the pokies because you're too bored and you can't think of anything else to do, and then you come home, you spend far more than you said you would, and you feel like shit.
That sounds horrible.
Yeah, exactly. Well, there's a lot of that going on.
Yeah, that's super sad. All right, look, I've decided to forego some of these other questions because they will be going well past 8 p.m. But hopefully there is an opportunity sometime in the future to speak with you again.
Sounds good.
What I wanted to do with this interview was I would try to make them all as evergreen as possible. Nothing in the news, nothing, but some type of hook where you can latch onto and say, like, this is an interesting worldview of this person. Here are some ideas about who they are. Like, for instance, we haven't spoken about much your family, where you're from, what your education was like, etc. Which is maybe details that could be filled in at a later point. But anyway, would you agree? Because otherwise we just got fun questions to finish on.
No, that's good.
All right. Across the spectrum of your career, are you more optimistic now than you've ever been? Because of these LLMs, because of the radical change.
No. I was naively optimistic. No, I'm not more optimistic. I'm fairly pessimistic, but that's very different to hopefulness is the thing that matters, or faithfulness is what matters, not optimism or pessimism.
And you're faithful.
Yeah. And well, they asked a guy called Herbert Marcuse, a Marxist scholar. I'm not a fan of his work, but they asked him, they said, "You're very cheerful and yet you're so pessimistic." And he said, "Yes, that's true. I'm a cheerful pessimist." So I'm a cheerful pessimist. My father had a saying, which was that an optimist is just a pessimist without the facts. Nice. And he was a sunny kind of character who participated in a great generation building from the ground zero, the scorched earth of World War II, into a great modern society.
And both of his sons became academics of one stripe.
Dave, my brother and I both tried very hard not to be economists, and we both failed.
Yeah. Well, at least your own boy has only partially
I know.
set foot in
Well,
that.
there was a brief period when my daughter was looking like becoming an economist, which I was thinking was at some stage I might have to break the glass and call an emergency. But she seems to have found her way to more constructive activities. That's right.
If you were to witness, not participate in, just watch a conversation between any two people in history, dead or alive, no language barriers.
Oh, God, this is so hard. I don't know. But wouldn't it be interesting, somebody from the ancient world, I think maybe Aristotle. I can't think of anyone in the modern world that I want to talk to.
Not Scott Morrison?
Not Scott Morrison, but Aristotle, some great figure. I mean, another one is Shakespeare. I mean, how that guy came up with what he came up with is, I mean, wow. So there's a couple of people on the dance card. And then, maybe the other person should be, maybe not Bennelong, but I've heard of Bennelong, an Indigenous person, somebody. Haven't you? Bennelong Point? The Sydney Opera House is built on Bennelong Point.
He's the geographically, I see what it is. But
Yeah. So he's the guy who the first fleeters captured. He's an Indigenous person. They captured him because they wanted to get someone who they could teach a little bit of English, and then he would be there. He would kind of be an ambassador between the whites and between the Europeans and the Indigenous people, and it's an extraordinary story. Anyway, he was an odd sort of character, very charismatic and kind of a bit of a show pony, and they took him to Europe and dressed him up in European clothes. It's an extraordinary story. In the end, he's a kind of broken person in some ways, but I don't have a strong sense of him. But, there are remarkable Indigenous people, and William Barak, is that his name? Was a reserve, and there were 5 reserves, and again, these facts mightn't be exactly right, but there were 5 reserves, and this was a reserve in which a Protestant pastor, a Scottish, I guess he's Presbyterian pastor, was on the border, and he helped this community build this extraordinary farm. God, the name is so close to the tip of my tongue. And these 2 great Indigenous leaders, Simon Wonga, and then he died, and William Barak, led their people and tried from Healesville Sanctuary into Melbourne. Such a moving story. And he would talk to the governor, and the people at the top of the tree were really quite sympathetic and trying to do stuff. And the middle managers killed everything that ever started and stole their money. And it's just a horrific story. And I don't know whether anyone saw this, any white people saw this, when he would present the governor with a little dot painting. This is sort of before dot paintings were a thing out of Papunya. And then when he died, they found lots of these paintings that he'd been doing the whole time. And it's just an amazing attempt to reach out. He would say to everyone, we've got to dress in Western clothes because then they'll respect us more, and all this stuff. And all this possibility, pissed up against the wall, no one gave a shit.
Oh yeah, it'd be great to.
So there you go. But it would take a long.
And Aristotle.
Yeah, very much
That'd
so. That would be very cool.
And finally, Nick, I've asked this question to every guest. What is a role that serendipity has played in your life?
Well, I suppose, meeting your wife, if it's a success, which it is. So then, getting a great wife and kids, serendipity. Your life goes on and amazing things happen, and you kind of make stuff out. I knew you asked this question. I should have a better answer, shouldn't I? It's not a very good illustration of serendipity that I haven't at least worked out something to say.
Well, at least where the circumstances under which you met your wife, were they very serendipitous?
No, they weren't.
It
doesn't fit the question. I just think that life is just one connection after another, and you make a lot of this serendipity in that, and it's one of the things that I think a lot. I don't know whether you want to call this serendipity, but the only education I got was doing history. I've done lots of other things, studied lots of other things at uni, and I wouldn't call that an education. And the thing about history was that I ran into a whole discourse at the time which was teaching people that you couldn't understand somebody unless you made the effort to understand them on their terms. You get a hold of a bunch of words and say, well, they didn't express themselves very well, but they're sort of trying to mean this, that you have to make that journey, and that can be a long and a rewarding one. And also, you're not likely to make that journey if you're not sympathetic to them. That's one of the reasons I'm sympathetic to Pauline Hanson and all these people. I draw the line at Adolf Hitler and Donald Trump. I can't be, because I think they're psychopaths. I don't think they're worthwhile. But even there,
they still had a set of experiences that.
Well, and if you want to understand them, you have to try and understand, what are they thinking? What is their perspective? What is their perspective? And so that is if you really believe that and you really inhabit that, you really get a payoff from that constantly. I got a payoff from that when I did economics. Before I trained in any economics, I did economics for John Button, and he was industry minister in the 80s. And what was my superpower? One, my father was an economist, so I got the hang of economic thinking, but I listened to people. So I would go and listen to people running car factories, and I'd get them to tell me their story. And all the free traders would say, well, they're just telling you that they need protection and they're just trying to mislead you. I said, look, I'll make that decision up later on. I just want to know what it's like from their point of view. And it was doing that enabled me that they were the ones who were talking about economies of scale, not the fucking economists who were using models in which there weren't any economies of scale. So that's a serendipitous thing, but it's a created serendipity. It's a serendipity comes from humility. I don't want to put myself, it would be a little ludicrous to present to myself to you as this paragon of humility. That's not quite the way it works.
Oh, that's how you've come across it.
That's what's that?
That's how you've come across.
But the ladder of humility, the I don't understand this. I'm not here to give this person a lecture. I'm here to hear what they think and then to listen for bits that I might not understand and draw them out a bit more. That might be the sort of thing you're thinking about as someone who interviews lots of people. One of the things I've noticed in this conversation is that when I'm trying to say something, you've been completely silent. That's great. That's great. Because that's what you want. When you're hearing someone not quite get an idea out, then shut up because you'll get something. And then once they've said something, you might say, oh, you're thinking this, or I was talking to this person. Don't say, oh, you mean that. So these are things we pick up, and so I've turned this into a little homily about making your own serendipity. That's not a bad answer.
I love that. That's 100% true. Because serendipity doesn't just have to be
exactly
an interaction in the real world. It can also be a discovery in a conversation.
A prepared mind. The discovery comes to the prepared mind, or as a famous chess player said, I'm not sure who it was, and someone said, you've been so lucky in your career. And he says, yes, my experience is that the better I play, the more luck I have.
All right, mate. Great place to leave it on.
Good. Okay.